Stay still up.
Yeah, it feels a bit awkward.
How about I just sledge in the background? Is that cool?
Oh, I could, instead of congratulating someone on being New South Wales Senior of the Year, I could sledge that she didn't get Australian Senior of the Year.
Right,
and just get stuck into the candidates whenever else stage.
That's a good guess.
But Shane Stansfeld apparently once associated with
Australia's finest jurisdiction.
they're one of the best in that. I reckon the person who's been chair not coming because they heard us first.
Honourable members, the Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? I call the member for Watson.
Thanks very much, Deputy Speaker. Abla Cutters was awarded New South Wales Senior Australian of the Year for 2022. Hajay Abla has worked in my community for over 35 years. In the year 2000, she established the Islamic Women's Welfare Association in Lakemba, to which she's dedicated herself ever since, and never would have expected dedicating all that work to women through a centre in one suburb to then being given this honour for her whole state. Led by volunteers, the Iowa is a thriving hub of activity and was born out of a need to cater for the growing faith and social needs of Muslim women, particularly from different language groups. Today they've evolved as the needs of the community evolve and provide a range of social activities for children all the way through to seniors. They run language classes, even jiu-jitsu classes for teenagers. Like a lot of organisations, Hajay Abla and Iowa have had to respond to the COVID-19 lockdown that hit our community hard and hit our community with rules that didn't apply to many parts of Sydney. They prepared hot meals and distributed food hampers around the clock, always relying on volunteers. Hajay Abla is an active member of my Watson Women's Network and someone whose long-term knowledge of my community and perspective is something that I value immensely, and I want to say sincere congratulations to Hajay Abla. Separately, I want to acknowledge with Lunar New Year. It's now the year of the tiger, and for many people in my electorate, in particular people with heritage that's Chinese, Korean or Vietnamese Australians, there's a lot to celebrate this year. But as is always the case in my part of Sydney, the invitation from each of those communities is always extended to everybody for us to all celebrate together. On Saturday, I attended the Korean Lunar Festival organised by the Korean Society in Croydon Park. I spoke there with the Korean Consul General, Mr. Sung-woo Hong, and during the conversation I was asking him his sense of the values of the Year of the Tiger. He went straight to strength and bravery. Looking back on the last 2 years, I can't think of a more fitting way to describe how my community have been able to find the way forward after being the epicentre of the virus and living through one of the harshest lockdowns in Sydney. A situation where mounted police were on the street, the army, they were told, was being called in, and helicopters were flying overhead at night, waking people up and imposing a curfew that turns out was not in fact based on health advice. Small businesses ran down their savings with very little support. I was proud of the incredible resilience shown by my community during lockdown and after, showing great strength and bravery in moving forwards towards recovery. Last year I spoke about how local celebrations for the Year of the Ox would be smaller than previous years. This year, Campsie will be back to hosting the night markets, complete with a lion dance. I want to wish everybody who is celebrating a happy and prosperous Lunar New Year.
I thank the member for Watson. I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I said in my maiden speech that your health should not be determined by your postcode. However, in my electorate of Mallee, accessing healthcare continues to be a real challenge due to workforce shortages in primary, specialist and allied health. I have to say we are fortunate to have skilled, dedicated professionals providing excellent healthcare for the communities across Mallee. However, there are and remain significant barriers. In Mildura, Monash University provides postgraduate training for medical students who come from various stages of their training elsewhere. But there is currently no pathway from secondary school through to the end of tertiary. This is an issue. Talented secondary students who wish to train in medicine must relocate to Melbourne or Adelaide or another major centre to begin their training, and frequently we then lose them. This profoundly affects our workforce and systematises the maldistribution of the medical workforce. Melbourne has approximately 1 doctor to 900 patients. In Mallee, we have regions where there are thousands of patients for 1 doctor. It is absolutely untenable. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue that I have relentlessly advocated for since I stepped into office. I recently invited the Minister for Regional Health, the Honourable David Gillespie, to meet with health leaders across Mallee and discuss this issue among other challenges of regional healthcare delivery. I met one junior doctor at Mildura-based public hospital who, after establishing herself in Mildura for 3 years with her husband, also a doctor, is now moving back to Melbourne to pursue postgraduate ambitions in palliative care. We are not just losing 1 doctor, we are losing 2. We need to build and preserve our medical workforce in our regions. We lose some of our best and brightest students because we don't yet have a streamlined undergraduate to postgraduate training program. We need a closed pipeline of medical training from secondary to tertiary completion. I've worked extensively in my first 3 years in office with the universities and the 5 federal ministers responsible for health and education, Ministers Hunt, Gillespie, Colton, Tehan and Tudge, to secure an undergraduate biomedical course with wet lab at La Trobe University in Mildura. This is a vital first step to the bigger picture of making Mildura an independent tri-state health precinct with end-to-end undergraduate and postgraduate medical degrees. One of the major wins in this term of coalition government is the implementation of the help debt relief for doctors and nurse practitioners who stay
time
and
has
work
expired.
in the bush.
I thank the member for Mallee and I call the member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Unfortunately, I have to rise again in the House to defend the property rights of the people of Horsley Park, Cecil Park and Mount Vernon, people whose property rights have been ripped up by the New South Wales Liberal government. Now, there have been updates since I last addressed the House on this matter. There has been a tiny step forward. The government has made further changes to this unfair SEP, and they have announced, and I quote, to ensure, they say, fair and reasonable consideration of requests for subdivision prior to commencement of the Aerotropolis SEP. Subdivisions applied for prior to the commencement of the Aerotropolis SEP on the 1st of October 2020 are to be permitted with consent. So if you applied, you'll be allowed to. But all those people who plan to subdivide their land, in many cases for many decades as part of their estate planning for their children, still have their rights ripped up by this Liberal and National Party government in New South Wales. And this isn't good enough. And I will continue to speak up for these people. And I will continue to point out that they are not being listened to by their state government. The state government claims to have, and again I quote, listened to the community, but the consultation process ran from the 8th of October to the 5th of November to put in a submission, less than a month. That is not listening to the community. So I've written to the people of Horsley Park and Cecil Park and Mount Vernon, letting them know of these developments, that there has been a tiny step forward. And I do continue to encourage these residents to voice their opposition to these ridiculous changes. Now, there has been another change, and I do want to be fair here. There has been another change. There has been a ministerial reshuffle in New South Wales, and there is a new Minister for Planning. And this isn't his fault. He didn't do this. And I have written to the new Minister for Planning, Minister Roberts, encouraging him to revise the changes made by Minister Stokes and to correct this wrong. And I say in this House, I've worked very closely with the Mayor of Fairfield, Frank Carboni, to pursue this case. I'm happy to work cooperatively with Minister Roberts and with the State Member Tanya Davies to get this fixed. All I want to do is see this fixed. These are people who have worked hard who have committed no crime other than planning to one day perhaps subdivide their 5 acres for their children. And these rights have been ripped away for no good reason. Badgerys Creek Airport is as far from these people as Drummoyne and Concord are from Kingston Smith Airport, to highly developed suburbs, with high-rises and apartments everywhere, and yet the state government thinks it's appropriate to say you can't take your 5-acre farm and turn it into a 2.5-acre farm because you're vaguely somewhere in Western Sydney, somewhere near Badgerys Creek Airport. This stinks, and it's got to be fixed. These are property rights for people that have been ripped up retrospectively with no consultation. Now, Minister Roberts has a chance to fix this. I will work with him to see it fixed so that these people, good people, can have their rights restored as citizens of Australia and as people who deserve nothing less.
I thank the member for McMahon. I call the member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I rise today to call out the 3,800 grain-growing businesses across WA who have produced an extraordinary harvest this year in the 21-22 season. Over the weekend, the Grain Industry Authority of WA produced its final tally for the harvest of 24.09 million tonnes. Now, Deputy Speaker, to put that into context, the previous best harvest in Western Australia was 18.1 million tonnes in the 16-17 season. Now, so that represents an increase over the previous best harvest of 25%. And just to put it in a little bit further context, even though the east coast of Australia had a very good harvest this year, WA produced 38% of the nation's grain crop. Deputy Speaker, it was an excellent season across most of the state, although unfortunately there are a couple of isolated pockets that didn't fare so well, and I just want to mention those. On the south coast and south of the Stirling Ranges, there was just too much rain, and some crops were washed out and unfortunately didn't perform as well as hoped. But most heartbreakingly for those growers in the eastern wheat belt who have suffered a series of dry seasons, were facing one of their best seasons in living memory, suffered the heartbreak of a frost in September, which robbed them of much of their potential yield. And as I say, I've experienced that myself, and it is the most heartbreaking thing in farming. Deputy Speaker, the reason we managed to achieve this is through the innovation and great work of our farming communities. A couple of innovations: early sowing and dry sowing to make use of every drop of rain that falls. Weed control, either through chaff carts and accumulating those weeds in heaps, or seed destructors, which are destroying the weed seeds as they come out of the harvester. Also, improved varieties and I'll say including GM crops, which I campaigned for many years prior to coming to this place. And those innovations, 2 of those 3 innovations came from an extraordinary constituent of mine, Ray Harrington. Ray's a farmer at Darkin and has previously won the Edison Award for Science and Innovation, well deserved. Deputy Speaker, the crop has to go somewhere, and can I congratulate CBH, the CBH Group, on receiving 21.3 million tonnes, and to Ben McNamara, the CEO, and his permanent staff, well done and thank you. And to the casual staff, I think they had up to 4,000 casual staff, including my daughter Emma, who worked at the Albany port and got great satisfaction of being part of receiving that crop. Well done to all of you. I can also say thank you to the truckies who delivered the crop, the machinery dealers and the mechanics who supported the farmers throughout the harvest, and to all the communities, because many of these small communities across my electorate, everyone has a connection to the local farming community and all made a contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank the member for O'Connor, and I call the member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, the Liberals are no strangers when it comes to selling off our public assets. But the dodgy deal struck by the New South Wales Liberal government to sell off Botany, Kembla and Newcastle ports is utterly scandalous. Novocastrians haven't forgotten the Liberals' sneaky, dirty deal that the ACCC has described as anti-competitive and illegal to prevent the Port of Newcastle from ever developing a container terminal. This week, the New South Wales Liberals revealed that they're up to their old tricks again, trying desperately to shut down any chance of establishing a multi-purpose deep-water terminal by calling for the sale of critical port access land at the former BHP Steelworks. Make no mistake, this is a deliberate attempt by the New South Wales Liberals to ensure that the development of a container terminal at the Port of Newcastle remains economically unviable. This is a concerted effort to block investment, entrench private monopolies and put a brake on regional development and employment in Newcastle. I want our port and our city to have a strong economic future. I don't want our region to be left stranded without options, being caught flat-footed as a global economy changes and demands for innovation and new energy sources every day become more and more prevalent every day. The container terminal proposal will attract an estimated $1.8 billion of private investment at no cost to the New South Wales Government. That's what they're blocking. The project will generate more than 15,000 direct and indirect jobs, provide cheaper freight costs for importers and exporters across the state, reduce unnecessary road and rail movements in and out of Sydney, add $1.3 billion to our regional economy and $2.5 billion to the national economy. But the Liberals aren't interested in creating jobs or bolstering the Hunters' economy. They're more interested in protecting their own jobs while they sell us all out down the river. It's not enough for this Prime Minister to come to Newcastle to stand alongside the Port of Newcastle and announce a feasibility study for green hydrogen. He has to stand up to the New South Wales Government. Any responsible government would encourage diversification and development of our port, not impose barriers that inhibit job creation and prosperity. Today I call on the Prime Minister to intervene, to call out the despicable actions of the New South Wales Liberal government and insist on a level playing field for amongst New South Wales ports and access to container trade. Only then can the Port of Newcastle realise its full potential.
The member's time has expired. I thank the member for Newcastle. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the duration of the pandemic, I've witnessed extraordinary acts of kindness and generosity by residents in my electorate. At its core, it represents the vibrant spirit of volunteerism which continues to thrive in our community despite the most difficult and challenging circumstances that have been thrust upon us. I've seen the incredible work of individuals who so often, through their own initiative, go above and beyond to support their neighbours in the time of crisis that we've experienced. And of course, I've also seen the incredible work of local community organisations across the full spectrum of activities, from the major national ones like Vinnie's and the Salvos to local ones like our community centres. Volunteering is the cornerstone of every community, and that's why I was delighted that last year in December, after a brief COVID hiatus the year before, I was able to host my annual North Sydney Community Awards, which I've run every year except for since my election to Parliament. These awards seek to celebrate and acknowledge those incredible individuals and groups whose efforts have contributed to making North Sydney a more compassionate and caring community. Today, I'd like to highlight some of the winners of the major prizes at those awards and acknowledge their service in the House. The North Sydney Citizen of the Year award went to Liz McKinley for her dedication, time and involvement in the establishment and continuing governance as chair of Mary's House, an organisation which provides such important support to women and children fleeing domestic violence. Liz has contributed her services since 2015 and is an outstanding leader. The North Sydney Older Person of the Year was awarded to John Hayward. John has made a significant contribution to the Lane Cove 12-foot skiff club over many decades, including in 2018 when he illustrated exemplary leadership when the club was attacked by arsonists. The North Sydney Younger Person of the Year award went to not just one but many of the amazing youth ambassadors of the Sustainable Sports Program, which had its genesis at the Northbridge Football Club and is making a real difference by reducing waste and encouraging environmental practices amongst our young footballers. The North Sydney Sport Achievement Award was presented to Rory Grace for his significant contribution to Northbridge Football Club, where he has been president for so many years. And the North Sydney Community Group of the Year award was given to LifeSource Community Food Care, who provide food and other basic groceries to people who are disadvantaged on a pension or just doing it tough. The LifeSource Church, which operates the food bank, does an incredible job, and I was proud to be able to volunteer with them during the pandemic to see that firsthand. I want to offer my congratulations and my sincerest thanks to all our winners, in fact 61 of them, and the nominees who nominated for them for their work. You are making our community a stronger one, and I know all residents are proud and thankful for the contribution that you're making every day of the year.
I thank the member for North Sydney and I call the member for Macon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as we near the end of this parliament and 9 years of coalition governments, it is timely, as we head towards the federal election, to reflect on the government's record. A 3-minute statement is not sufficient time to cover every issue, so I will summarise my observations. What is prominent in people's mind is that over the past 9 years there has been a revolving door of Prime Ministers, Deputy Prime Ministers, Government Senate leaders and ministerial office holders. This has been a coalition government characterised by dishonesty, disunity, rorts and incompetence. A government racked by several disgraced ministers who have presided over the $1 billion robo-debt debacle, which also cost people's lives, the ongoing crisis in aged care, the deterioration of national health services, worsening inequality with the highest 10% of households by wealth now owning almost half of all wealth and the lowest 60% owning just 16%. Australia's education outcomes have markedly fallen when compared with other countries. On climate change, Australia now ranks near the bottom of 61 countries on the Global Performance Index. Australia has the second highest level of biodiversity deterioration in the world. Then there is the Morrison government's total mismanagement of the NBN rollout that not only nearly doubled the cost from $29 billion to well over $50 billion, but NBN speeds are amongst the slowest in the developed world. The Great Barrier Reef is at serious risk. Australia's foreign aid contributions are at an all-time low. After 9 years in office and now into its third proposal, the first nuclear submarine is not likely to be in service for another 2 decades. And whilst Australians call for more honesty in government, the Morrison government refuses to have a National Integrity Commission, but it has stacked the courts and administrative appeals tribunals with its mates, many of whom are underqualified for the job. In other attempts to avoid scrutiny, it has cut $783 million from the ABC and millions from the National Audit Office. The coalition killed off Australian car making, but now pretentiously talks about backing Australian manufacturing. And at a time that it talks up national security, it presided over the 99-year lease of the Port of Darwin. The Morrison government has reached its use-by date. It is tired, it has no vision, little credibility and $1 trillion of debt to its name. It is little wonder that the Morrison government is once again relying on a dishonest national security scare campaign for the upcoming election. We saw that again in question time today. That's because it has nothing left to campaign to run with, and the Australian voters will see through the spin come election time.
Thank the member for Macon and I call the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's an honour to speak today about some of the wonderful people from Bennelong. I've always been so proud of the vibrant sense of community within Bennelong and the generous and supportive locals that contribute to it. As part of the Australia Day 2022 honours, a number of Bennelong locals were deservingly recognised with awards, and I'm proud to be able to share the achievement of some of them with you now. Firstly, congratulations to Sally Ruston from Epping, who was awarded the Member of the Order of Australia for her significant service to primary education and to professional associations. In conjunction to her contribution to teaching, she has also been involved with organisations, the Independent Primary Schools Heads of Australia, the Association of Independent Schools, the Independent School Teacher Accreditation Authority and the Australian Primary Principals Association. Before receiving the Member of the Order of Australia last month, Sally had already received a number of other awards and recognition, including the Honorary Fellowship, Teachers Guild of New South Wales in 2021, the Australian Primary Principal of the Year, non-government, the Educator Australian Education Awards in 2019. The next Bennelong local I would like to speak about is Karen Ward from West Ryde, who received the Medal of the Order of Australia for her service to sport as an administrator and player. Over many years, Karen has provided her service and support to a number of sporting associations such as West Ryde Rovers Sports and Social Club, North West Sydney Football and the Eastwood Ride Netball Association, ERNA. I've had the pleasure of attending many ERNA events and match days. ERNA is a truly great local sporting association with thousands of members and supporters, which is well managed by Karen, who is the current president. Karen's support and service to young sports people, especially young girls and women, is commendable. Finally, I also offer congratulations to Mervyn Whiting from Marsfield on his Medal of the Order of Australia for his service to veterans and their families and to the community. Over the years, Mervyn has been involved with a number of organisations, including the Returned and Services League of Australia, Freemasons New South Wales and ACT, Australian Legion of Ex-Servicemen and Women, and Scouts Australia New South Wales. Mervyn has also served the community through his professional life as an officer and Major Australian Intelligence Corps, soldier with the Royal Australian Infantry Corps, telephone counsellor on Lifeline, Australian Federal Police Officer and a New South Wales Ambulance Officer. Mervyn, you are a champion. Again, congratulations, Sally, Karen and Mervyn, on your wonderful achievements, and I'm so proud of your efforts, and you make Bennelong the best electorate
I
of
thank
Australia.
the member for Bennelong, and I call the member for Blaxland.
Thank you very much. Last time I spoke in this chamber, it was to wish everyone a Merry Christmas. And I think we all hoped after the last 2 years that we've had that it was going to be a good summer. Summer's supposed to be a time where Australians get a break, they get to relax, we get to catch up with family and friends. And the Prime Minister promised us that that's what would happen. But this summer was stuffed up for a lot of people in Australia by this government's mistakes. I remember driving around my own electorate over summer, looking at the massive, sometimes endless queues of people lining up in the sun and in the rain to get a COVID test, people forced to stand there for hours. And I remember going to my local chemist, trying to get a rat test, and the chemist just laughing at me. They were almost impossible to find. Instead of being at the beach, a lot of people were forced to drive around from chemist to chemist to chemist, sometimes from my electorate to yours, maybe even yours, Acting Speaker, trying to find one of these damn things. And if you were lucky enough to get one, then chances were you had to pay too much for them. I got an email from a constituent only a couple of weeks ago. She said she bought a rat test online from a major Australian company, and the postage fee was $90. $90. Now, if that's not a rip-off, I don't know what is. And all of this mess meant that people couldn't go to work. Truck drivers couldn't go to work. If truck drivers can't go to work, it means the trucks can't deliver goods. And so we ended up with empty shelves in the supermarket. People didn't just have to go from chemist to chemist to chemist. People had to go from Woolies to Coles to Aldi just to get basic things like meat and fruit and veg. Any of us to do the shopping would have seen the empty shelves. No wonder people have had it with this government. No wonder they're angry. The government talking points use the word frustrated. They're more than that. They're really off this government, because these are the sorts of things that shouldn't happen in Australia. And it wouldn't have happened if this Prime Minister and this government did their job and just ordered enough tests last year. Incompetence has consequences. It didn't just stuff up people's summers. In a lot of aged care centres, older Aussies have been locked in their rooms, not allowed, not been showered, not been changed, not been properly cared for, been neglected because staff are off crook. I got a call from someone last week telling me that her mum fell out of her chair at an aged care centre a few weeks ago. There was no one there who witnessed it. She had a stroke on the floor of the aged care centre, was rushed to hospital, and 2 weeks ago died. We used to call these places nursing homes because they had nurses in them. That's not the case anymore.
I thank the member for Blaxland, and I call the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The arts and creative organisations across Melbourne are home to some of the most vibrant and diverse in Australia. Just look at some of the amazing major theatre productions in my hometown, including Moulin Rouge, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, and the highly anticipated Hamilton, only a few weeks away. And we also have a myriad of excellent smaller productions and shows that are not to be missed. As the member for Higgins, I've helped advocate for some of the very best local artists, businesses and organisations in the arts sector who are now weathering the economic storm of the COVID-19 pandemic thanks to unprecedented support from the Morrison government. I'm also proud to have called for a national inquiry into the arts as part of the Communication and Arts Committee. I look forward to the Minister's response to our Sculpting a National Cultural Plan, including a recommendation to develop a national cultural plan to assess the medium and long-term impact of COVID on the sector. Last month, Madam Deputy Speaker, Federal Arts Minister Paul Fletcher came to Higgins and met some of the organisations benefiting from the highly competitive federal government's Restart Investment to Sustain and Expand Fund, which is called the RISE grants, and the popular Live Music Australia grants. We met with the owner of popular nightclub Chasers, Martha Sarmas, and her team, and we learnt how they'll utilise the $36,000 in federal funding under the Live Music Australia program. This grant is supporting them with the installation of audio upgrades and staff training in sound and lighting to produce an even better experience for their loyal clientele. Chasers is actually a popular destination for Higgins' thriving LGBTIQA+ community, as it showcases the very best of the best from the award-winning RuPaul's Drag Race franchise phenomenon. I can't wait to pay Chasers a visit soon when some of the queens sashay into this fierce nightclub. Chasers joins other local clubs, artists and organisations in Higgins benefiting from funding under the additional federal government support to help kickstart the creative economy post-COVID. The total package of federal government support for the arts sector stands at over $970 million in extra funding in response to the pandemic. This is on top of an annual investment of around $750 million in core funding in 2020 to 2021, and on top of more than $730 million provided by JobKeeper and the $119 million provided by cash flow payments. This funding has been critical and timely as it's enabled our businesses to continue to operate during this unprecedented and unpredictable period of severe disruption. Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to state that I'm very proud of the fact that the federal government is, following on from a recommendation of the Arts Review report, has committed to an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural precinct, Nguru, which will be built on the shores of the Lake Burley Griffin in the Parliamentary Triangle on Ngunnawal country in Canberra. This is a fantastic outcome for our Indigenous arts cultural precinct. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded. I call the clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 1. Death of former Senator the Honourable Michael Eamon Behan AM. Resumption of debate on the condolence motion.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Brand.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise today to pay tribute to Michael Behan AM, 19th President of the Australian Senate. Michael Behan was a true Labor man and a great Australian. His story is one with which so many of us can relate in some way. Like a third of Australians, Michael was a migrant coming to Australia as a 16-year-old and worked at a factory manufacturing electrical equipment. He got an apprenticeship as an electrician and established his own small business. In his late 20s, Michael went back to study as a mature-age student. He attained an arts degree and an education degree from the University of Western Australia and became a secondary school teacher. It was this combination of factory floor background, trade qualification and teacher education that led Mike Behan becoming WA Trades and Labor Council's first ever education officer and later the Trade Union Trading Authority's Western Australian Director. In 1981, Behan became WA Labor's State Secretary. He led Labor's successful win from opposition to government at the 1983 state election and then won again in 1986. He also led the WA campaign for the 1983 federal election, again winning government from opposition and turning the erstwhile blue seats of Canning, Moore, Perth, Stirling and Tangney a deep shade of red. Perth has remained a Labor-held seat ever since, under the stewardship of that great hockey player and champion Rick Charlesworth, another great hockey player Stephen Smith, Alana McTernan, Tim Hammond and the incumbent Patrick Gorman. 1983 is also the year in which Wendy Phaeton was first elected to Parliament as a member for Canning. Wendy was, of course, then became the first member for Brand when the seat of Brand was created in 1984. Michael Behan also led the WA Labor campaign in the 1984 federal election, at which not a single newly won Labor seat was lost to the Liberals. nor were any WA Labor seats lost in the 1987 federal election, in which Behan was not only State Secretary but also elected as Senator for Western Australia. Deputy Speaker, Michael Behan's principal legacy during his time as State Secretary was the modernisation of WA Labor's campaigning infrastructure, practice and culture. He brought new techniques and a new approach to campaigning. Behan saw the value of modern campaign technology, from imagery to lines and themes, things that all of us here in this place would know now as common tools in the campaign arsenal. In the 1980s, they were new and innovative. Michael Behan championed campaign innovation and training and ensured that those who followed him will be best placed to steward the Labor Party forward. Deputy Speaker, much will be said of Behan's time in Parliament as a senator. Unsurprisingly, he became a leader within the parliamentary party and of the Senate itself. Among Michael's lasting legacies is the art collection of the Parliament and the acquisition program that he is responsible for creating. When he arrived in his Parliament, there was little art from Western Australia or Queensland or from the Northern Territory, and no urban Aboriginal art at all. This has changed, and now the corridors and our offices see art from everywhere in the nation and includes many emerging artists. When I was first elected in 2016, I was very keen to see what was hidden in the basement of the Parliament, where the collection is carefully stored. It is a wonderful treasure trove, and I thank the curator for facilitating a tour a number of years ago. It's a very great honour and a privilege for each of us to be able to select art for our office walls. Members and senators get to see a trolley load. Those that look after this collection come and see us in our office and offer us these great gifts to mind for a while, and we should be very grateful for them. And that is all thanks to Michael Behan. I often reflect in this place on how interrelated we all are, particularly in politics. I never met Michael Behan, nor worked with him within the movement, but his successor as WA Labor State Secretary was Stephen Smith, with whom I worked at the Perth US Asia Centre at UWA. And from what I understand, Behan, like Smith, was a keen supporter of Paul Keating's Prime Ministership. Moreover, Michael Behan used his influence within the ALP to ensure the election of Gary Gray as National Secretary from 1993 to 2000. Gary was, of course, my predecessor as a member for Brand and remains a valued political mentor to me and many members in this place, and of course now is also Australia's Ambassador for Ireland, based in Dublin, and I hope he is well. So, Deputy Speaker, there is no doubt I owe my presence in this chamber today in no small way to this man whose life we are commemorating this condolence motion. It is an honour to stand on the shoulders of giants like Michael Behan. I express my sincere condolences to his family and loved ones. I hope your memories of Michael provide you solace and comfort in these challenging and sad times.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Yesterday I did have the chance to speak very briefly about Michael Behan's extraordinary life in the House, and I appreciate the opportunity again here amongst some of my particularly Western Australian colleagues to speak about a wonderful man who made such a wonderful contribution. He was a dear friend to me. He was kind, he was generous, he was gentle. He was very generous with his time and his offering of advice to me as a new MP, particularly, and throughout the last couple of years. Kindness and generosity are not usually associated with politicians, Deputy Speaker, as you know, but Michael was nonetheless known for his kindness, and he was no less effective for his gentle nature and his kindness. He actually left a formidable legacy of service to the Australian community and to the Labor Party that he loved so much. He served as Western Australia State Secretary for the ALP, and during that period he put in a number of processes. In fact, I think he was instrumental, really, in ensuring electoral victory in Western Australia during those years. He then served as Labor Senator for WA from 1987 to 1996, and as President of the Senate from 1994 to 1996 during the Keating Labor government. And we can all see in the corridors here at Parliament House his portrait when we walk past. After Parliament, though, he remained deeply committed to the Labor Party and deeply committed to working for others and for his community. He was a very strong advocate for the role of neighbourhood houses in local communities, for health services and many other local social justice projects. And as I said, Deputy Speaker, he was one of those really genuinely lovely people that grace this planet from time to time, and that the rest of us, frankly, have the good fortune to know and to befriend. He was a very good politician and a very good public servant in the truest sense of those words. He was a good man. It was never about his ego, he was always about helping others. But I'm just one of the many, many lives he has enriched. And many members of the local Brunswick Labor branch, which he was a member of, and the wider Wills electorate Labor family, have met and spent a lot of time with Michael over the years, lucky enough to share in his wisdom and his passion for social justice. I reached out to them, Deputy Speaker, and asked to hear their stories about Michael. Here are just a few, and I quote first from his friend Michael Petit in Brunswick. Michael says, "When Caroline and I first came to Australia 40 years ago, we both read a wonderful book and now treasured book, A Fortunate Life by Albert Facey. A life lived honestly, humbly and a sense of purpose and concern beyond self." That was Michael. He was a Western Australian of the highest principles and character, and he was our friend and good mate. I'm not going to comment extensively about Michael's stellar political career. He was a true believer, and that was made clear from the top down. But what I will comment on is his friendship, characteristics that made him a person you just wanted to spend more time with. I never met a man more generous with his time and devoted to making life better for all around him. He was a skilled speaker and advocate for causes, but also a ready listener to other voices. In short, he was somewhat of a national treasure. His death a few weekends ago was tragic for all of us and his friends. And Michael goes on to say, "But you are never really gone when you live in the hearts and memories of so many." And Michael says, "I will revise the Facey book title to say, Vale Michael Behan AM, A Most Significant Life." And he would insist that we now toast one another with a really good Shiraz. This is from Malcolm Harding. "I can't say that I knew Michael that well, but we did work together for a time when, for his sins, he managed to have himself appointed to the role of chair of the Celtic Club's disciplinary committee." That must have been quite the job, disciplining Celts. "I'm a barrister and I was appointed as advisor to this committee. Michael was given the gig, I suspect, due to his expertise in dealing with fractious behaviour. Michael brought a quiet calm to a querulous situation. He was hell-bent on being fair and being seen to be fair despite provocation." Deputy Speaker, his good friend Anne Taylor said that 3.5 years ago, Michael was a board member of Merry Health, and it was coming to time to renew his position. But instead of running again, he said he wanted to quote, "a good woman to stand." He approached Anne, which Anne tells me in and of itself was a huge honour. But he was also not the sort of person to handball anything and just let it go. He worked hard to mentor Anne and supported her through the election. Anne recalls Michael was always there when she needed him. And she remembers he had one of those oodle dogs named Millie, and boy, did she adore him. Did she adore Michael, as we all did. No one was allowed to disturb their time together on the couch. He loved that dog, and I'm sure Millie will miss him too. Mark Higginbotham, former Mayor of Moreland, had this to say: "Michael always had a lot to contribute. He made Brunswick his home and loved being a part of the Brunswick community. I will remember Michael as a very inclusive individual. He gave encouragement to women, to multicultural groups, was passionate on Indigenous affairs and LGBTIQ+ issues. Anything, you name it, Michael was a part of it. He was a true believer. He was truly admired and loved by all at the Brunswick branch." Deputy Speaker, it's clear that he will leave a legacy that will endure for those of us who are fortunate to know him, but also much broader than that for the community that he impacted. I extend again my condolences to his partner Margaret, his children Daniel and Kate, his stepchildren Georgia and Michael, and their families. I will very much miss Michael and our times that we spent together talking, and the advice he gave me and his insight and his wisdom. He was a special person. Vale Michael Behan.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Perth.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today I join with other members in recognising the contribution of an Australian Labor Party stalwart, Michael Behan. I was going to say Western Australian, but it's clear from all of the contributions that he is loved across the party, across the states. I'll start by acknowledging Michael's family, his wife Margaret, children Daniel and Kate, stepchildren Georgia and Michael, and their collective grandchildren. I'd also like to acknowledge Michael's brother, a long-serving member of the Joondalup branch in Western Australia, Terry. Terry still attends branch meetings and volunteers to elect Labor governments wherever he can. I know this is very sad news for the Joondalup branch and for Terry and friends in particular. Like Michael, my own career path into this building included some time serving as the State Secretary of the WA branch of the Australian Labor Party, something that Stephen Smith and Chris Evans have also had the privilege to do. And like Michael, I was proud to help deliver WA Labor electoral success. But Michael's challenge when he started as State Secretary was that the Western Australian Labor Party had won just one of the previous 8 state elections. He turned that around. He elected a solid, long-term state government and at the same time made a huge contribution to the election and re-election of the Hawke government. And in that office, which has moved around a few times over the years, but there still remains reminders of Michael's time in that role, the party machine that he helped build, and the electoral success that he helped deliver. And he came to that role having had a life that was as diverse as the policy interests which he pursued in this place. Born in London, 21 January 1937, migrated to Perth in 1954 with his parents and 3 of his 4 brothers. He worked as an apprentice, an electrical fitter, and as an electrician then for 10 years. Following a quite tragic car accident, he retrained as a teacher. And while teaching in Bunbury, where he became active in politics, a member of the great Bunbury branch of the Australian Labor Party, the Bunbury branch still a powerhouse of the Australian Labor Party in Western Australia. He was elected president of his local branch and grew its membership through legitimate means, which was how we did things back in the day, from 30 members to 150. He really inspired people to the cause of Labor. He worked as an education officer in the union movement and served as State Secretary of WA Labor, then the Australian Labor Party branch then the Australian Labor Party WA branch from 1981 to 1987. He was a strong advocate of the rights of rank-and-file members, and that wasn't something that he just believed in to get himself to one position or another. It's something that continued throughout his entire time as an active member of the Labor Party, both in Western Australia, in this building, and indeed in Victoria. He believed that our policy was better and stronger where it had been developed in consultation and in partnership with party members and the trade union movement. That consultative and collaborative approach is probably why, when he entered the Senate in 1987, he became heavily engaged in the committee system. In his work on the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, he supported the full disclosure of all political donations. He believed that that was vital to the integrity of the political process. He, in other committees, advocated for stronger regulation and to ensure a more level playing field for small investors. And, earning the respect of his colleagues, he was elected in 1994 as the 90th President of the Senate, serving until 1996. As others have said, he was at times critical of the Senate, and he had long memories of the Senate's role in the events of 1975. But his experience overcame those criticisms and those scepticisms, where he eventually said, much useful work is done in scrutinising and critically appraising the decisions and activities of government, as he backed in the important work of the Senate committee system. Recognising also that they were there to do work, not to play dress-ups, he was influenced in the Senate advocating for the removal of wigs and gowns. After leaving politics, he married his second wife, Margaret, and together they moved to Victoria. He remained active in a number of roles, including with the Pharmacy Guild, continuing his passion for making sure that people have access to healthcare and health services. And in 2011, he was appointed rightly as a member of the Order of Australia for, quote, the service to the Parliament of Australia, to the promotion of international bipartisan political debate, to the pharmacy profession and to the community. He was, as we've heard from the speeches from the member for Wills, the member for Brand, and I'm sure we'll hear the member for Burt, he was so much more than that, though. I would like to, as I mentioned before, in the WA Labor offices, there are many things that remind party members of the time that he ran the party organisation. Similarly, in this building, there are many things that remind us of Michael's time in this place through the art collection. As he said in his valedictory speech, I was very pleased with the support of the Speaker and others. I was able to introduce the art acquisition program to redress an imbalance that was created by budget cuts. There was originally almost no Western Australian art, very little Queensland art, no urban Aboriginal art and very little Northern Territory art. Every day that we wander through this building, we can be reminded of the broad, diverse impact that Michael Behan had, not just on the building, but on the fabric of Australia. Vale, Michael Behan.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Burt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to pay tribute to former Senator Michael Eamon Behan AM. Former Sparky Unionist, State Secretary of the Australian Labor Party in Western Australia, and notably former Senator. Pivotal in ensuring the WA branch of the Labor Party won government in 1983 and was re-elected in 1986. He played a role in the successful federal campaigns in 1983, 1984 and 1987. When he entered federal parliament as a senator for Western Australia during the Hawke-Keating era, he made it clear in his first speech to the Senate that he was concerned with getting things done, and that he did. He was committed to parliamentary committee work and worked to modernise the parliament in his role of Senate President. He took on the almighty challenge of lifting the standards of question time in the Senate, recognising that the televising of question time had a significant impact on the public perception of the work of the parliament overall. As a good adopted Western Australian, Senator Behan advocated for our state, one of the most memorable being the recognition that the parliament reflected almost no Western Australian history and art, as well as that of Queensland, the Northern Territory or urban Aboriginal art. Rightfully now, the portrait of him in this building pays tribute to his work in establishing an art collection that is more reflective of our federation. Senator Behan played an important role in the modernisation and modernising of the Western Australian Labor Party and the Australian Labor Party nationally, and that cannot be overemphasised. And it contributed greatly to its electability through the 1980s and 1990s. And of course, his contribution helped make our parliament what it is today. I extend my deep condolences to all of his family. Vale, Michael Behan.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. And I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I just want to acknowledge the previous contributors, particularly being from WA. They have an excellent understanding of the impact and the legacy of Michael Behan, being from there. But of course, as honourable members have heard, he came from the UK, Irish parentage, and made his way to Perth, as many fine Australians have over the decades, including some friends of mine who I served with in the Australian Defence Force, including some of those who defended Darwin. So many great Australians have made that trip across the oceans and have made our country better, and Michael Behan certainly made this parliament and the body politic in our nation better. Being a Sparky, he brought life experience to his work in this place. In manufacturing, getting an apprenticeship and working as an electrician obviously gave him an excellent understanding of what working people were doing in their lives every day for him in an East Perth factory. He also in Perth did some compulsory military service, 3 months full-time and 2 years compulsory part-time service with the 13th Field Squadron of the Royal Australian Engineers. And I know exactly where he served, Deputy Speaker. During my time in the forces, I served with the 13th Brigade, and in fact a good mate of mine was the OC of the 13th Field Squadron. A great outfit with great history, and I didn't know that about Michael Behan's history. He would have learned a lot there. He decided to go back to study, and like some of my colleagues, had a great education, in Michael's case in arts and education at the University of Western Australia. From his education that he received at that time, he became a teacher. He was then, as he became more involved in the unions, he represented teachers. Having had the experience of being not only a Sparky but a teacher, he was well placed to become the State Secretary of the Western Australian branch of the Labor Party. And it was great to hear a former State Secretary of the Western Australian branch talk about Michael Behan, and I won't go over a lot of that material, but I did want to focus on another thing about him and his time in this place that I think is very important. With some defence experience, he would have made great contributions to the Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committees, but also the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. Having come from part of the Commonwealth, he would have enjoyed that, but I just want to focus a little bit on his contribution to the art collection because it involves people from the Northern Territory as well as WA. I think it's important to note that nowadays, due to Michael Behan's insistence, there is a lot of outstanding First Nations art in this building. I've done some research with the good folk down at the collection, and I want to thank them, Deputy Speaker, for their assistance. They pointed me to several pieces in the collection that were a direct result of Michael Behan's insistence that we broaden out the scope of the art here, in particular to get some representation from WA, the NT and Queensland. One piece, which I've now got my eye on well and truly and hope to have it in my office at some time, is from, with the artist was David Damaringu Malangi, a Yolngu man born in Central Arnhem Land in 1927. He was moved to the Milingimbi mission until that was bombed in World War II. And we're coming up to the 80th anniversary of those bombings. When I was with Norforce, I served with a Damaringu, Norman, who still serves our nation with Norforce today. A proud family and an awesome artist. It's great to know that that history and his depiction of the Arafura swamp is in our collection because of Michael Behan. Also there is several pieces from the Pintupi people, including one here from Ronnie that won the Alice Springs Arts Prize in 1988. And I'll provide Hansard with the spelling of his surname, so I didn't have the opportunity to sit down with Warren Snowden and work out how to say it properly. So I won't have a go at it. But there are really strong lines in this art piece. As I said, it won the 1988 bicentenary year, won the Arts Prize in Alice Springs that year, and that's in our collection, thanks to Michael Behan. Another Pintupi artist, and these people are from the Western Desert of Western Australia, but they also live in the western areas of the Northern Territory as well. Incredible artists. Another one, Joseph Jarrah. Well, he's had his artwork shown from Papunya to New York, and his work, because of Michael Behan, is in our collection. Also, Gloria Pecciari from Central Australia, who unfortunately died last year. She created so much amazing art, and again, because of Michael Behan, it is within our collection here at Parliament House. I just wanted to flesh a couple of those out. The people who made the design behind this tie that I'm wearing now, from the Simpson Desert, from the Western Desert, those people and their artwork, because of Michael Behan, hangs now on the walls of our offices and in our collection. It is said about Michael Behan that he had politically great influence beyond his numbers, but I would put it to all honourable members that, particularly through the artwork, he's had significant influence in terms of the artwork and the telling of Australia's stories in this place well beyond his years. I think Michael Behan would be happy with modern Labor these days, striving for a better country where there's secure work, good living standards for working people, and as a former Sparkian manufacturing guy, a welder, a future made in Australia. Vale, Michael Behan.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Like many people who grew up in Western Australia, as often happens, I first met Michael Behan on a beach in Bali. I was probably about 14, and my family was having a holiday, as were the Behans, and we met each other there for the first time, and had a few dinners together, played with their children. And as is the way in Bali, and you might know this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, many people go there and think, oh, I've got to haggle for everything and drive it down to the lowest possible price. And in talking with my mum and dad about that holiday and that trip that we had there, one thing that they remember that stood out about Michael was his insistence in coming to us and saying, I've been around, I've spoken to all of these people who are living here, trying to make a living out of selling us things, found out how much they get paid. For heaven's sake, don't haggle. They need a living wage, pay them a fair price. And that was something that stuck with our family and with me for a while. And when I moved over to Melbourne, we obviously lost touch, drifted apart, but I was really delighted when, much later in life, after being elected the member of Melbourne, I get an appointment one day in my office to talk about an issue to do with a local neighbourhood house and who should turn up but Michael Behan. And having enjoyed a very distinguished career in this place, in the Senate, which didn't overlap with my time, he then continued, after moving over to Melbourne, to make enormous contributions to the community, not only with respect to his involvement in Merry Health, but also his involvement with the neighbourhood houses. Now, neighbourhood houses, as many members in this place would know, are absolutely critical for binding together communities, and we found that especially during COVID, that that is where the fine-grained work of looking after people and tying together communities is done. And through his involvement with health, but also with neighbourhood houses, he continued giving an enormous amount, including to the people who live in Melbourne. And So it's not only on behalf of the Greens that I want to extend my thoughts and condolences to all his family and to all who are missing him. And not only personally, as someone who remembers that time spent on the beach together, but also on behalf of my community for the work that he continued to do that made a big difference to the lives of people in Melbourne. So condolences to his family and all those who are mourning his passing. Vale Michael Bean.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Scullin.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I certainly didn't meet Michael Bean on a beach in Bali. I met him after his parliamentary services ended, when he was going about the work that the member for Melbourne touched upon in his community and more broadly in Melbourne. And I'll return to that in a minute. But I think his public life is something that is worth touching upon, as was done in the chamber and has been done here by other speakers. As someone who came to this country as a migrant, like so many, he built a life for himself as a tradesman and as a teacher, and made an extraordinary contribution to my political party, his political party, as reforming State Secretary of the West Australian branch, and then in this place as a Senator for West Australia, where he made a very significant contribution, a contribution in the things he did in his time in the other place, most notably as President, and people have touched upon the living imprint of his desire to see this building accurately reflect the country and all of it as it is, not simply to see it frozen in time. And I think that's something that all visitors to this place appreciate, and it's something that I do too, cherishing the notion of this building as something belonging to every Australian. He also made a very significant contribution in his committee work and in the way he went about his work as a senator. Always a strong Labor partisan, but going about his work without rancour and in a collaborative spirit. And as I say, when I met Michael, it was those qualities that were most immediately apparent. Many people who serve this country and their party in public life are not seen so often in community life after that comes to an end. But I think Michael Bean must have been as active in that latter stage of his life as at any other time. He made an extraordinary contribution to community, and I echo every sentiment expressed by the member for Melbourne about both the important role of neighbourhood houses and the role that Michael Bean played in sustaining the great movement that enables neighbourhood houses to do the great work that they do in so many communities around my city and around our country. He also continued to serve the party that he loved and which I love. And I know that the members of the Brunswick branch in particular, but Labor members across Melbourne and Victoria, as well as back in the West, will be thinking of the extraordinary imprint he had on our movement and knowing that that imprint will be enduring. It was remarked in the chamber by the leader of the Labor Party that his very image conveyed a kindness, and I think that's true. His personal qualities were remarkable, and it is them that I will be thinking of as I also think of his family and all those who loved him and are missing him. Vale Michael Bean.
Thank you.
The question is the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Menzies.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, can I add a few words? Can I add a few words to the obituary for Michael Bean? I didn't know Michael well, but I was the deputy leader of a delegation to the United States and Canada with him in, I think it was about 1995. He was President of the Senate, so that opened doors that might not have ordinarily been opened, including to the White House to meet with then Vice President Al Gore. A very memorable meeting with the oldest serving senator in the US Congress, Strom Thurmond, who had a four-star general as his aide and passed him a set of notes which we could all read from either side as to what he said to us as members of the visiting delegation. But it was an interesting delegation because of some of the characters on it, which included Mel Colston, who's probably better forgotten in this place, I suspect, than mentioned, and also Alan Griffith was a member of that delegation. But despite our differences, as these delegations are, we worked very well together, and that was in part because of the leadership of Michael Bean. He was well informed, he was a gentleman, he didn't hog the limelight on the delegation. He shared around the tasks and the opportunities to say thank you to our various hosts in different parts of the country. We went to Chicago, New York, we went to Columbus, Ohio. You might ask why Columbus, Ohio, because there was a potential US presidential candidate, the governor then of Columbus, Ohio, and the embassy thought this was a good opportunity for them to meet the gentleman concerned, so we went there as well. But throughout it, Michael was remarkable in the leadership that he showed of that delegation. I've met him over the years on and off in this place and just bumped into him in a number of places since he left the Senate, and that was always friendly, also always a very informed commentary about things that were going on. And can I add to the comments, particularly by his colleagues from the Labor Party, in extending my condolences to his family and to may he rest in peace.
I understand it is the wish of the honourable members to signify at this stage their respect and sympathy by rising in their places, and I ask all present to do so. I thank the Federation Chamber. I call the member for Menzies.
Deputy Speaker, I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
Is leave granted?
Mr Speaker, Deputy Speaker, I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
Is there a seconder?
I second the motion.
Thank you. The question is that further proceedings be conducted in the House. All those of that opinion say aye. I think the ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Anniversary of the national apology to the stolen generations. Further statements.
Are there any statements? I call the member for Melbourne.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The trauma of the stolen generation sits deep, and it doesn't just hurt those who were taken. It hurts their families and people who come after them. In my time in this place, I've had the privilege of working with Senator Lydia Thorpe and Senator Dorinda Cox, and one of the things that I have started to learn since being here is the meaning of the word intergenerational trauma. Because what it means is the pain that was suffered because of the violence and dispossession and the racist policies that saw children being stolen didn't just happen once. It happens over and over again. And it happened not just to the children that were taken and their families, but the unimaginable grief and trauma that that inflicted gets passed down to people who continue to live it. And they continue to live it not only because it has been part of their family life, but because it continues to happen in too many respects. It continues to happen in many ways in our society now, where we see much higher rates of First Nations children being taken, but also where we see children, babies, being locked up in a system that says children as young as 10 in some places in this country can be taken and put in prison. Prison is not a place for children, but it is what we are doing, and is what we are doing disproportionately to First Nations children. And so some of the policies have ended, but some of them have continued. And so First Nations people now, as I'm learning day by day, First Nations people now aren't just having to deal with the traumas of the past that we, as white people in this country, don't do a very good job about being honest about, but they're having to deal with ongoing trauma being inflicted and re-inflicted day after day, including on their children. And when we look back and understand that this country that we call Australia has at its beginning a huge act of violence and dispossession, We've got a lot of truth-telling to do in this country if we're to ever move forward. We will heal, and we can heal at some point, but only if we start by telling the truth. And telling the truth, including about the violence and dispossessions and the racist policies that have inflicted so much trauma. Once we tell the truth, then we can start to heal and reconcile. And apologies are critical parts of that, which is why the apology to the stolen generation is such a significant moment, and why it's right that we come back in this place and mark on it and reflect it. But apologies have to be fully given. Apologies have to come without conditions if they're to be full apologies. But what did our Prime Minister say when it was his turn to come and speak? He said, sorry is not the hardest word to say. The hardest is, I forgive you. Well, no, Prime Minister, it is not in your remit to be talking about offering forgiveness. That is something that only those who injustice has been inflicted upon are in a position to offer. And in many instances, they're only going to do that when they think there's sincerity and when they think there's been truth and when they think there has been healing. And that is why, when this sorry with an asterisk came during this really significant occasion, there was outrage. There was outrage from the First People's Assembly of Victoria, who said, get in the bin. And there was outrage from our Senator Lydia Thorpe, who said, how dare you ask for forgiveness when you still perpetrate racist policies and systems that continue to steal our babies. Stolen generations and their families and survivors do not owe this Prime Minister anything. When the Prime Minister stands and addresses the country, people need to hear that he understands the pain and not that he is somehow there suggesting that the next step must be forgiveness. The apology must be unconditional for it to mean anything, but this one came with an asterisk. There is work to do. Forgiveness is something you earn, not demand. And we have to start in this country by telling the truth, especially for those of us who benefit from the decades of dispossession and violence that have happened and come before us. All of us who are not First Nations people benefit from it, and it is time that we told the truth about that. And we can do some practical things. We can do some practical things like have a proper and fully serviced national compensation fund that is not going to take away the pain, but will go some way to helping people address it, and will go some way to acknowledging the pain and suffering. And that's what we've been pushing for, is a nationally consistent compensation scheme, as well as ensuring that there are the range of services available to provide for the emotional and mental health needs of survivors. It is something that makes sense, and it is something that we will continue to push for. But when we have a situation where descendants of the stolen generation are twice as likely to have experienced discrimination in the last 12 months, 1.9 times more likely to have experienced violence in the last 12 months, and 1.6 times as likely to be in poorer health compared to other First Nations people, we have a responsibility to apologise fully and unconditionally, but then to set about a process of action and healing. And to come back to where I started, Mr Deputy Speaker, in this country, we do not do a very good job at telling the truth about our history. And we see time after time governments intent on whitewashing history, saying there's only certain accepted, sanitised, whitewashed versions of the history that can be taught in schools, and anyone who dares ask questions about what happened in our country's history, it's no longer allowed. It's no longer allowed. This government's going to use its position to say there's only one official politically correct way of thinking and speaking and learning in our schools. But for so long as we fail to tell the truth, all of us are going to suffer. All of us are going to suffer. You can't sweep this under the carpet. You can't sweep history under the carpet, especially because in too many respects it's continuing to happen. What we need is a process to tell the truth, and then we can talk about justice, and then we can talk about treaty. Other countries have done this. Other countries have begun the process of telling the truth about the shameful acts that lie in their history. Because there is an understanding that it's only by doing that and then by reaching agreements that we're going to be able to move forward together as a country. And moments like this, as we reflect on the abject shame that is the removal of children from their families purely on the basis of race, as we reflect on this, we need to do more than words, and we don't need to offer apologies with asterisks. We need to say this is a moment to heal, but to learn from, because it's only by learning from it and beginning to tell the truth that we're going to be able to fully heal. There is so much promise for this country if we do that. By joining the other countries who have told the truth, who have treaties, who have voices, by doing that, we all will gain. And that is the optimistic future that lies ahead for this country. But it won't happen if we fail to tell the truth, and it won't happen if we give apologies with asterisks.
I call the member for Herbert.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak more from a personal experience and my family. And I wasn't going to speak today. And then I saw two photos of my little girls. And there's nothing in this world that I love more. And my two little girls, Aston 3 and Emery 1, are both Aboriginal girls. My wife's Aboriginal. My mother-in-law, born in Palm Island, a part of the stolen generation, born in a jail. The trauma that she has lived through her whole life is something none of us here would ever be able to comprehend, understand, and therefore we find it, I believe, that a nation finds it easier to not talk about it. And that's why I decided to come in today and pay homage to my family and my mother-in-law and say sorry. Say sorry that this occurred to her and to thousands and thousands of other families around the country. My wife's tribe, my mother-in-law's tribe, is Junganan and Ganjanji, and I apologise for getting that wrong, but I think it's important, and that's from Mount Mulligan, it's from the Tablelands. They're rainforest Aboriginals. But I want my daughters in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, however long I sit in this place, to know that their dad stood up and spoke. And it's a weird feeling for me because outside of Veterans Affairs issues and my family, I'm not an emotional person. But thinking about the horrors that have occurred well before my time, it just takes the oxygen out of me. It wins me that this happened to Australian people. It wins me that my beautiful wife had to deal with the trauma that follows and the systemic racism that followed. And it pains me that unless we stand together, that my daughters will go through the same. That might sound like a selfish thing to say, but it's about as open and honest as I can ever be. because when it becomes real to you and you feel it in your bones, it drives people into action. 50 years ago, my mother-in-law was at the Aboriginal Embassy out the front of Old Parliament House. 50 years ago, a young Florence Burns, is her name, was arrested by the police, protesting and standing there fighting and putting her hand up to be counted. Florence is someone that I've often asked questions upon around Australia Day, around different awards that I've been received, and I brought Florence here for my maiden speech, where she hugged Ken Wyatt, hugged the Prime Minister. I think she was hugging everyone that day. I've never seen so much pride in her. And it was because I know that she felt that she has a voice here now, through her daughter, through me, through her grandkids, who I'm sure in a couple of weeks will be asking when Granny's coming down from Cairns, and I'm sure that my wife will be enjoying it. A bit of time to relax. My kids are a handful, as I'm sure Joshy over there understands all about. I know that Pat Dodson, my mother-in-law, went straight up to him and gave him a hug, because there's a time when we debate with aggression, and there's a time when we debate together. And I think with my contribution here, this is a debate together for me. And I know that I find it refreshing, and I know that the member for Melbourne didn't find it refreshing, but I found it refreshing to listen to the Prime Minister yesterday, and I found it refreshing to listen to the Leader of the Opposition, Anthony Albanese, and he's someone that I've spoken to about Aboriginal issues before, and as well as veteran issues. When I served with lots of people, our First Nations people, whether they were Torres Strait Islanders or from the land, all around the country as Aboriginal people, and I just saw them as brothers, really. I've fought in wars with them. I've had them injured. I've been injured, they've looked after me, and I didn't see anything else. But when I met my wife, I started to look deeper into just the veteran defence brotherhood, to what did they go through when they were growing up? What did their parents have to endure? And I think that it's all of our responsibility to acknowledge the atrocities that have occurred to create a better future for our First Nations people and for all people, and to walk hand in hand. And I think that that's something that I've had to learn through my growth as a young man, and it's something that I'd like to instill upon others. And I hope that people who dial in from the seat of Herbert around towns will go, yep, I get it. This is about us acknowledging the atrocities. It should never have happened, and I'm sorry for that, but now work together for a better future. Because I want my daughters to grow up learning and understanding and knowing the bad that has happened in our world, but then looking and going, I can do anything. I want my daughters to sit, if they so choose, in Parliament, with other strong women from around the country on all political divides, and through their ability. And I want them to look through Hansard and go, you know what, their contribution that day meant something to me. And it means that we work together with open arms and create a future where this should never happen again. So I'm sorry that this occurred. I'll never understand what my mother-in-law went through, and the people throughout this country, and the people of Palm Island, which is in my electorate. I'll never comprehend it. But what I promise to do is to listen, to learn, to ensure that we as a nation never do this again. And I want a bright, very bright future for my two Aboriginal girls when they go through school and they grow up and not have to go through the things that my wife went through. And I just know that the standing up and talking about it regardless of political party, changes how our future will be. And I'm very feeling like very confident that with the strong people in our parliament, the strong young women in our parliament, and the Aboriginal people in our parliament, we will guide this nation, regardless of the political divide, for a better future for our First Nations people. Thank you.
Call the member for Jagga.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I begin by noting that I'm speaking today on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging. Thank you to the member for Herbert for that very personal contribution. It was a really important contribution, as have all the personal contributions to this anniversary been during this debate. And they really highlight that it is important that this Parliament continues to mark the historic apology Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered, because the effects of the policies and the practices of the stolen generations reverberate down generations. And that's why that apology made 14 years ago needed to be made. It was a very special day in this place. I wasn't here then, but hearing from so many people about the emotion involved in it. It took so much courage for people who've been so wronged to come to this institution, this Parliament, this institution that had failed them so profoundly. And the members of the stolen generation came here to Parliament House to witness that apology. It was an apology that was a long time coming, and it was promised to them after years of rejection and resistance. And I believe it was a unifying moment, and for many it is one that will never be forgotten. I think it says a lot about the priorities of a Labor government of former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd that it was the first order of business of his new government. On that day, Prime Minister Rudd said, "We today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians." And it must be said that we can't look to our future without reflecting and being honest on the past, because until we acknowledge the full weight of our history, the full truth of our history, we will always be burdened by it. It is important that the wrongs be acknowledged, that we learn from them, and that we look and seek for the ways of healing. Until last year, this anniversary was also the time when we assessed the Closing the Gap report in this Parliament, the annual report that still catalogues the unacceptable chasms that divide Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Australia. And those chasms are a reminder that speeches do not always lead to action. They can just be words if we don't all commit to actions that do better. The historic speech to the stolen generations, it will always hold its special place in our national story, but it should hold a special place as the start of a new chapter, not as the end of a chapter. The next chapter must be about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I actually feel very proud as an Australian that we have been given the Uluru Statement of the Heart, that it has generously been presented to us, that Indigenous people are saying to us, here, take it. We can go further as a nation. And we should feel the generosity of that request for us to take it up and the possibility of the requests that are in that statement. Voice, truth, treaty. Labor is committed to all three, to the voice to Parliament enshrined in our Constitution, to truth, without which we really can't walk forward together as a nation, and treaty, emerging from a Makarrata Commission which Labor will establish. Truth can be confronting, but truth does not have to lead to conflict. Truth-telling could and should be seen as a step in finding grounds for the healing that allows this country to write that next chapter, to write a better chapter. We should come to the process of truth-telling, not as if we're approaching a battle, but as if we are open to exploring the terrible things that happened, to acknowledging those, and to finding a way forward. The apology that was given in this place was incredibly important in helping us to confront a painful past, to bring us to the end of one journey and now hopefully to the beginning of another one. It is important we acknowledge this anniversary. It is even more important that we acknowledge that the work is not done and that we get on with delivering the Uluru Statement from the Heart.
I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I too would like to start my contribution by acknowledging that we stand today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and that in my community, our land is the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to particularly acknowledge everyone in my community who is a member of the Stolen Generations or has family members that were members of the Stolen Generations, and everyone at Nirmajambana, the gathering place by the bay, which is our local Indigenous community centre. On the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the apology to Australia's Indigenous peoples. In that apology, Prime Minister Rudd said this, and I quote, "The time has now come for the nation to turn a new page in Australia's history by righting the wrongs of the past and so moving forward with confidence to the future." Prime Minister Rudd apologised for the laws and policies that had inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians, especially for the removal of children. And those consequences of policies and laws of successive governments, of stripping people of culture and family and history for so long, stripping them of country, means that the grief, suffering and loss continues, and the gap on so many measures that are so important between First Nations Australians and those of us who came here much, much later is still much closer to a chasm than a crack. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd ended the apology with this, and I quote, "A future where all Australians, whatever their origins, are truly equal partners, with equal opportunities and with an equal stake in shaping the next chapter in the history of this great country, Australia." As my friend the member for Jagga Jagga said, that next chapter is clear. It is the generous and beautiful Uluru Statement from the Heart. It is delivering voice and delivering truth and delivering treaty. And too often, people talk about the Uluru Statement from the Heart without understanding the beauty of what's in it and what it's asking for. So I want to quote from the Uluru Statement. "We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement-making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future." That trek that started in 2017 is still going, and it's faced some barriers, and I'm sure there will be more barriers to come, but I make this pledge. I accept that generous invitation to walk in a movement of the Australian people for a better future, side by side with our First Nations brothers and sisters. And the Labor Party accepts that generous invitation. And we'll do everything in our power to bring to bear voice, truth and treaty and the better future that will come with it. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
And I call the member for Brand.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to the Wadjuk and Pinjarap people of the Noongar Nation on whose traditional lands my electorate of Brand sits in Western Australia. I've said before in this place, I feel sad at practically every Welcome to Country ceremony I attend and acknowledgement of country that I witness. My response is from a deep sorrow of how painful the British-led occupation of this continent has been for those who have been here for eons. My sadness is born out of regret for what we, as newcomers to this land, have missed out on by our centuries-old practice of dominating every culture we find, taking whatever we want, and dismissing languages and lifestyles and lives we don't care to understand. Luckily for us newcomers, Indigenous Australians have a millennia-old practice of patience and care for this land. 65,000 years on this continent is an eternity for human purposes. New Australians living off this continent for 230 years is but the blink of an eye in relation to that endless timeline. But those short 230 years have devastated Indigenous Australia. Nonetheless, our First Nations sisters and brothers are patient with us and continue to try to share their extraordinary culture, history and knowledge of country with us, with good humour and generosity, despite our ignorance and despite how long it has taken us as new Australians to understand all that we have missed out on. After so much trauma and hurt, after so many years of being told no, and after a hard-fought election campaign in which Kevin Rudd committed to saying those two simple words that carry so much meaning, I'm sorry, the national apology was a solemn moment of national healing. And for anyone in the electorate of Brand, I'm really pleased to be able to provide anyone who asks for an official copy of the national apology that Kevin Rudd issued in 2008. Some people may have noticed a photo I keep in my office. It was taken on the day of the apology. To be honest, I don't know how I came to have this photo. I just don't know. It's got no acknowledgement of the author, of the artist who took it, the photographer who took it, or of the women who were in it. And I'm going to describe it for the House. It is a photo of 4 Indigenous women standing in the front court of the Parliament. 2 of them have T-shirts that say sorry, and 2 of them have T-shirts that say thanks. Sorry, sorry, thanks, thanks. They are arm in arm, leaning into one another. I think it's one of the most remarkable photos of our time, Deputy Speaker, and that's why I keep it with me on my desk at work. It sums up how important it is to say sorry, and equally how important the generosity is of our Indigenous sisters and brothers who can so easily say thanks for what shouldn't have been as hard as it actually was. So if anyone knows who took this photo or the women in it, I'll be most grateful for them to get in touch, because I would really like to get another copy of it. It is a really amazing piece of Australian history. Now, just as faith without works is dead, so is an apology without a change in behaviour. Australia on that day in 2008 resolved to change to make things better for our First Nations communities. 14 years later, and there is just as much work as ever to be done. Hard work, policy work, cultural work, discussion, consultation, inclusion. Not enough progress has been made to close the gap. The Closing the Gap project has been disappointing, not least because of its slow progress. But falling short of our goals should not mean abandoning them or celebrating mediocrity. No, it means that we strive on forward by our shared commitment to being better than we were before. And on this side of the House, the Labor Party is committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Paul Keating said in Redfern in 1992 that there is nothing to fear or to lose in the recognition of historical truth or the extension of social justice or the deepening of Australian democracy to include Indigenous Australians. There is everything to gain. There is everything to gain in listening to Indigenous Australia, working with them and adopting in our hearts and our Constitution the Uluru Statement from the Heart. This year marks 55 years since the successful 1967 referendum, which sought to ensure First Nations Australians were included in our community. It marks 30 years since a historic Mabo decision of the High Court, which reversed a 220-year-old legal fiction that sought to obliterate more than 60,000 years of Indigenous land custodianship. It marks 5 years since the Uluru Statement from their heart was shared with us. I sincerely thank and honour our Indigenous sisters and brothers and other leaders who have supported these just causes. Now it is time to share this burden across the country. Now is the time for us in this place to show leadership and to ensure that truth is heard, that voices are heard, that rights are enshrined and that reconciliation is real. I thank the House.
And I call the member for Greenway.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the custodians of this land, and I also honour the Darug people of the Eora Nation, representing an area that was known as the Blacks Town. It is always mindful that we have the highest urban Indigenous population in Blacktown in New South Wales, if not in all of Australia. And I particularly want to thank my office manager, Nicole Duffy, who was a proud Wiradjuri woman who wrote this speech for me. Her late father, Philip Duffy, was a Vietnam veteran. He was also a very high-profile policeman in Riverstone, and he passed away during COVID in 2020. He did not get the send-off that he deserved, but he is honoured by his dear daughter Nicole and their family every day. On the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued an apology to the stolen generation by moving a motion in the House of Representatives. This finally and formally acknowledged the wrongs that were inflicted on First Nations people. However, prior to this historic apology, the Honourable Paul Keating spoke of the horror and torment inflicted on First Nations people in his famous Redfern address in 1992. His words were both stirring and emotional, in particular when he said, "It begins, I think, with the act of recognition. Recognition that it was we who did the dispossessing. We took the traditional lands and smashed the traditional way of life. We brought the disasters, the alcohol. We committed the murders. We took the children from their mothers. We practiced discrimination and exclusion. It was our ignorance and our prejudice and our failure to imagine these things being done to us. With some noble exceptions, we failed to make the most basic human response and enter into their hearts and minds. We failed to ask, how would I feel if this was done to me?" The forced removal of children from their families saw a profound impact on First Nations children and families that is still felt today. Families were broken, communities were shattered, and a proud people were left with missing pieces to their family trees. Many of these missing pieces will never be recovered. The children who were forcibly removed suffered a loss of identity, robbed of their connection to country, their kin and their language. Horrifically, many children who were institutionalised often suffered unspeakable physical, mental and sexual abuse. The physical scars may heal with time, but the psychological damage is still being felt across the generations. Kevin Rudd's motion meant for the first time a government had acknowledged and apologised for the hideous atrocities inflicted on our First Nations people. He went on to say, "We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on our fellow Australians." Those words were echoed through the chamber and over the live stream videos across the country. And I must say too, I remember being a lawyer at the time at Gilbert and Tobin, and Danny Gilbert, who continues to this day to be a champion of First Nations justice and reconciliation and recognition. He gathered the entire firm into our main meeting place, and he didn't force anyone to be there, but everyone wanted to be there for this historic moment. And I want to honour Danny Gilbert, the efforts that he makes, and as he has said, we must deliver for First Nations people. We must deliver voice, treaty and truth. And I thank Danny and the partners of Gilbert and Tobin in particular for their leadership and for taking this journey for so long. The raw, heartfelt grief and sadness was met with hope, a hope that we as a nation learnt the gravity of these policies and vowed that it would never happen again. Archie Roach summed up what many of the survivors went through in his song, "They Took the Children Away." He sang of the pain of being ripped from his parents' arms, being separated from his siblings, losing connection to his country, kin and language, and being raised white while being black. As I stand here today, it's hard to imagine how a government legislated to remove children and shatter families simply because of the colour of their skin. And this is something that took place until quite recently in our history. The apology was brought about following the Bringing Them Home report, the findings of the National Inquiry into the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, which was instigated by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. 54 recommendations came out of the report, and today many of these recommendations remain unfulfilled. One of the key findings out of the report recommended for reparation, and this reparation should include the following: an acknowledgement of responsibility and apology from all Australian parliaments, police forces, churches and other non-government agencies which implemented policies of forcible removal, guarantees against repetition, restitution and rehabilitation and monetary compensation. In reading this report, it is hard not to feel the despair of so many, in particular a man by the name of Paul. His mother was tricked into putting him into care while she recovered from a serious illness. While she recovered, her son became a ward of the state. She fought for her son to be returned, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. He wrote, "My mother never gave up trying to locate me. She wrote many letters to the state welfare authorities, pleading with them to give her son back. Birthday and Christmas cards were sent care of the welfare department. All these letters were shelved. The state welfare department treated my mother like dirt and with utter contempt, as if she never existed. We must as a nation move forward and ensure that those lives that were lost were not in vain. We need a treaty, we need to close the gap, and we as a nation must learn and heal together." While the apology took place prior to my election in this place, as a member, I too say sorry for the pain many First Nations families still face today as a direct result of these past policies and practices of successive governments. Today, as we meet in this place, it should be noted that in November last year, a motion in the Senate to fly the Aboriginal flag in the chamber was defeated, a simple, necessary act that moves us one step closer to being united and resolute in our stance with this country's First Nations people. Yesterday, it was 14 years since this historic apology, and sadly, recent data from the Productivity Commission shows that up to June last year, up to 22,000 children were living away from their parents, and more than 8,000 of these children live in New South Wales. 14 years on, we still have so far to go. If we're serious about history not repeating itself and reconciliation, we must work together with First Nations communities all over this country. We must acknowledge and accept our part to play and be serious about moving forward.
I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I acknowledge that this parliament sits on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri peoples, and I honour their ongoing contributions of all First Nation elders, past and present, that are part of the world's oldest continuing culture resident here in our nation. We're remembering the apology, that amazing speech given by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And it was a seminal moment in our nation. I remember it mostly for the impact that it had. When I saw Kevin come up to Darwin, to Royal Darwin Hospital, and there are lots of countrymen out the front, as there often is. Lots of First Nations elders that have come in from communities, either for health treatment themselves or to visit loved ones, to support their friends and family. And I'd been working with Jose Ramos Horta, the former president of Timor-Leste, at around the time that he survived an assassination attempt. So we brought him back to Royal Darwin Hospital. Kevin Rudd, as Prime Minister, new Prime Minister, had come up to Darwin to see Jose. And as we went in the doors of the Royal Darwin Hospital, out the front, as I said, those elders, and they just said, "Thanks, Kevin. Good on you, Kevin." And it was without fanfare. There were no cameras. It was from the heart, and it was just expressing that bit of relief, a bit of joy, a bit of gratitude that someone had extended that apology on behalf of our nation. And it was something I will never forget. Never forget. It was beautiful, and it showed that we, as a nation, that we had heard the apology as a nation, and that we were proud of it as a nation that it had been done. Of course, we kind of wondered why it took that long, what deficiency of humility, of grace, had led to such a delay in the extension of that apology. But it was a wonderful, wonderful moment. If I, as others have done, reflect on some personal experiences, in the late 70s, I suppose, I was a young fella, maybe, I can't remember the year exactly, but it was maybe in the early 80s, but a school friend of mine had, his parents had gone to work on an Aboriginal mission in the wheat belt of WA, a little place called Tarden, near Mullawa. And so I went over there to visit my friend. I think it was the first time I'd ever been on a plane from Melbourne over to Perth, and then by road up to this mission. And so it was my first experience with Aboriginal people over in WA. These kids were amazing sportsmen, sportswomen, sports boys and girls. They were incredible. And it was a great experience to be out with them on their country. I was going to a high school in Healesville, in the hills north of Melbourne, which of course is where Coranderrk was. And we had some Aboriginal kids at St Bridget's Catholic Primary School, but I hadn't really connected. But being out on this mission, I saw what I thought at that time seemed to be working for everyone. But of course, in time and in maturity, you realise that whilst an education is important, being with your family is incredibly important. And as I moved to the Territory and met so many other members of a stolen generation, gained a fuller appreciation for this trans or intergenerational trauma and harm caused by the separation. So that's why I was really, really keenly accepted in the gratitude and humility in which former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd offered that apology on behalf of the nation, because in the top end there are lots of people who have had that experience, and their families have been taken away. And Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs Linda Burney articulated that incredibly well in her speech following the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition speech in this place. When the member for Barton, Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, during her speech was acknowledging some of the First Nations members in this place, including Senator Malarndirri McCarthy and Senator Pat Dodson from the Labor Party. She also mentioned former Senator Nova Peris, who, when she joined the Senate, was the first First Nations woman elected to our Parliament. And I had the good fortune to work with Nova for a period. So I report to the House that post-politics, Nova's doing incredibly well. She's established the Nova Peris Foundation. Of course, her family obviously had connections with being part of the stolen generation. So very real for people in the top end. But Nova has established the Nova Peris Foundation. She's doing some project work with the Tiwi Islands. The Royal Australian Navy recently had commissioned the new ship Arafura down in Adelaide, which I think is extremely appropriate. And she can take or feel very proud that she played a strong role in that campaign to free the Aboriginal flag. So yeah, well done, Nova. A bit of an update for the House. But so many have been touched in the top end, as I said, and what Paul Keating knew was the power in his speech 30 years ago in Redfern, the power of truth on our reconciliation journey. So I hope that, we are able to institute, following the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the voice, treaty and truth. We will have that opportunity to bring about further healing, and also through practical action, not just, but in health and housing in particular. When Kevin Rudd delivered the apology, people got to know Lorna Fijo, who's the mum of a good friend of mine, Richie Fijo and the others. And a couple of years ago, when Lorna had a significant birthday, we lined up a call so that Kevin could wish Lorna Fijo a happy birthday. It was a beautiful moment, and back then in 2011, when Kevin delivered the apology, he said to Lorna, "Do I call you Auntie?" And she said, "No, you can call me by my skin name, Kevin, Nangala, Nana Nangala." Nana Nangala, Lorna Fijo is unwell at the moment, and we send you our love and appreciation and the respect of this House.
Order. I call the member for Canberra.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land this parliament stands, and that the electorate of Canberra is their land. I want to acknowledge our Indigenous Affairs Minister, Ken White, our Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Linda Burney, Senator Patrick Dodson, Senator Malarndirri McCarthy, Senator Jackie Lambie, Senator Lydia Thorpe and Senator Dorinda Cox. And I also want to acknowledge today any members of my community who were members of the Stolen Generation or whose families were members of the Stolen Generation. 14 years ago, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd formally apologised to the Stolen Generations on behalf of the Australian Government. It was an important and long overdue moment in our nation's history, and like millions of Australians, I clearly remember the feeling of that day and the importance of that moment that so many had fought for and worked towards over many, many years. It was not the end, but to be the beginning of a new chapter, looking to a future where we are honest about our history and come to terms with it as a nation. And at the time, Prime Minister Rudd said, "For the future we take heart, resolving that this new page in the history of our great continent can now be written. We today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians, a future where this Parliament resolves that the injustices of the past must never, never happen again, a future where we harness the determination of all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to close the gap that lies between us in life expectancy, educational achievement and economic opportunity. A future where we embrace the possibility of new solutions to enduring problems where old approaches have failed. A future based on mutual respect, mutual resolve and mutual responsibility. A future where all Australians, whatever their origins, are truly equal partners with equal opportunities and with an equal stake in shaping the next chapter in the history of this great country, Australia. The apology was a significant step towards reconciliation, and it's time we had the courage to continue that journey. And that is why the Australian Labor Party is committed to implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. It has been almost 5 years since Australia's First Nations peoples called for voice, treaty, truth, and it is clear that these should be our next steps. It's why we must confront the truth that we continue to fail First Nations peoples. Today, First Nations peoples have a shorter life expectancy, the highest rates of incarceration in the world, lower levels of education, and still too many First Nations children are removed from their families. My friend and colleague Linda Burney, the member for Barton, speaking about the impact of the apology yesterday, asked Australians to use our imaginations to envisage what life is like in remote communities during the pandemic. She said, imagine what living in a remote community is like, with 15 or 20 people in a 3-bedroom house. What's that like? Imagine not having enough rapid antigen tests to go around when local services are failing because there aren't any staff to step up when those on the front line have to isolate and when less than half of the community is vaccinated. She says, every day I hold my breath and hope, because that failure could mean the end for far too many who carry our culture and language. Our elders are our libraries, they are our internet, they cannot be replaced. I am so proud to work with Linda in our party and that she is leading our policy platform for First Nations peoples, and to work with her in our First Nations Caucus Committee. We have to ask ourselves, would these issues persist if the voices of First Nations peoples were heard by this Parliament in the way that they have asked them to be? Self-determination is a vital step towards reconciliation, and it is one that Labor is fully committed to, and we are the only party that is fully committed to this. And I'm proud that Labor is committed to this. Labor will establish a Makarrata Commission as a matter of priority and enshrine it in the Constitution with a First Nations voice to Parliament. Labor will also expand justice reinvestment, establish consolidated real-time reporting of First Nations deaths in custody and at a national level, and double the number of Indigenous rangers. These are the next steps that Labor will take, that Australia must take. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was an incredibly generous gift from First Nations people to Australia, and it called for those 3 key things: voice, treaty, truth. Voice, an Indigenous voice to our Parliament, enshrined in the Constitution, advising our nation's legislators on matters affecting First Nations communities. Treaty. Australia is the only Commonwealth nation yet to sign treaties with First Nations people. Treaties are an essential step in acknowledging and giving legal effect to the rights and interests of First Nations Australians. And truth. A comprehensive process of truth-telling about the true history of this nation, once marred by dispossession, conflict and genocide, and one which acknowledges the true strength and resilience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Labor is fully committed to the implementation of these things. I want to finish my speech today by reading into the Hansard once again the incredibly moving words of the Uluru Statement. It is important that we remember these words and the wishes of First Nations people when we have these debates. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thitherto, be reunited with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise, that peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted. In 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. This statement came from the most comprehensive deliberative process of First Nations peoples in Australia ever undertaken. This is what they have asked of their Parliament. How could we not accept this generous gift and walk together into a better future? Voice, treaty and truth. This is what we need for healing. This is a next step in reconciliation, and I am so proud that a Labor government would do this, and I look forward to our Parliament doing this, hopefully in the next term. Thank you.
I call the member for Ballarat.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I too begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, the traditional owners of the land on which this Parliament meets. I acknowledge our Indigenous members of this place, the member for Hasluck, Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the member for Barton, Senator Dodson, Senator McCarthy, Senator Thorpe, Senator Lambie and Senator Cox. It seems unimaginable now that it is only a few years ago that we didn't have members of their community here in this place, and it seems extraordinary the changes they've made in such a short period of time, and we all wonder why it didn't happen earlier. I do extend that acknowledgement to the Wadawurrung and Djadjabwurrung peoples, the traditional custodians of the land that my electorate of Ballarat falls within. 14 years ago this week, the Parliament finally said sorry to the stolen generations, and I remember that day very well. I was heavily pregnant with my son Ryan, who's now 13 years of age, and it was an incredibly unifying and proud moment for the nation. And I hope very much once he emerges from his slightly grumpy teenage years where he's not really that interested in what his mum does, and he looks back hopefully and reads Hansard in his late 30s, maybe 40s or 50s when he's doing family history when I am long gone, and goes, well, that was pretty amazing that I was within my mum's womb at the time when that actually amazing moment happened. 14 years ago, we said sorry for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on our fellow Australians. We said sorry for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country, and the ongoing harm it has done for generations. We said sorry on behalf of all Australians. It was, as I said, one of the proudest days in Parliament, and I believe one of the best days of this Parliament. It was an example of what our Parliament and our country is capable of when we have compassion in our hearts and unity in our heads. Today I again want to acknowledge those families, those communities and those histories torn apart by historic injustice. Just because those acts happened a long time ago doesn't mean that the damage does not linger, nor do harm throughout generations. I particularly want to recognise those who came here that day to accept our apology, who came to this place with a grace, perhaps more than we all deserved. Like many regions around Australia, Ballarat too cannot escape the history of the stolen generation. Nazareth Babies' Homes, Ballarat Babies' Homes, Ballarat Orphanage, St Joey's, all house children of the stolen generation. Children from as far away as Gippsland were taken from their homes, stolen from their families and their culture to be raised in our hometown of Ballarat. Ahead of my contribution to the apology debate 14 years ago, I learnt some of this history by reading Faded Footsteps Walking the Past, produced by the Ballarat and District Aboriginal Co-op. This book told the story of Uncle Murray, who was here on that day, taken from his family in Gippsland, and as he said, by the time my auntie realised we were gone, we were in Melbourne. He was later separated from his two sisters and put in what he described as a cell. When you're 10 years old and you've never been shut in and you go into a dark room and the door is shut on you, well, 60 years later, I can still hear that rotten door shutting. It told the story of Karen Atkinson, who spent 10 years at Ballarat Orphanage, a place that I later worked for. Karen's mother died 3 weeks before she left the orphanage and she never saw her again. Diane Clark remembered this. So they bailed us up there and took the parents, dragged them off kicking and screaming and around to our window, and they were fighting. Our parents were putting up a good fight. Our mum was real little but was fired up and was fighting for her kids. And I remember seeing the police just giving it to her, just punching her on the ground. The love of a mother up against the institutions of the state. At the apology 14 years ago, Prime Minister Rudd asked us to do one thing. Imagine if that was you. And in the years since the apology, I now have a child of my own, and the thought of him being taken is just unimaginable. And these are just 3 stories, and there are countless stories that come from around this nation. According to the Bringing Them Home report, between 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families between 1910 and 1970. They were placed in institutions and church missions, were adopted or fostered, and were at risk of physical and sexual abuse. Many never received wages for their labour, and welfare officers failed in their duty to protect Indigenous wards from abuse. They're not in the distant past. Survivors of the stolen generation live amongst us today, as do their children and their children's children. They were removed from their families solely on the basis of their race. It was fitting that the apology was the first act of the Rudd government because Australia faces no more important task as a nation than reconciliation. That apology 14 years ago did not solve the problems. It was neither the beginning nor the end of the road towards reconciliation, but merely a step along the way. It was a process that a century ago, continuing through William Cooper, the granting of citizenship in the 1967 referendum, the Tent Embassy, the Barunga Statement, the Deaths in Custody Royal Commission, Mabo, the Redfern Statement, and bringing them home. After the apology, there remains more to do. And as Mr Rudd said, or Prime Minister Rudd said, we today take this first step by acknowledging the past and laying claim to a future that embraces all Australians. We now need to renew the work of laying claim to that future. The apology led to the Closing the Gap process, an important process. But we know that First Nations people are still far more likely to be jailed, to die by suicide and have their children removed than non-Indigenous Australians. Between 2013 and 19, the rate at which those children have been placed with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers actually fell from 53.6% to 43.8%. Out of the 17 targets that have been set, only 3 were on track. Speaking on the most recent Closing the Gap statement, the Leader of the Opposition said we're surrounded by unfinished business. Even worse, we're surrounded by business that hasn't even been started. This 14th anniversary should be a moment to reflect and a moment to move forward. We're now coming up to the 5th anniversary of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and what the Leader of the Opposition rightly described as a patiently extended hand waiting for us to take it and to go further as a nation. I remember at the time of the apology 14 years ago, there were people, including people who are still in this place today, who felt that making that apology was somehow going to take our nation backwards, who still believed that on that day 14 years ago. And the reality is that the world didn't fall apart. Nothing changed other than, as a nation for the first time, we actually unified in the grief that had been caused by our institutions, and we made a pledge together to move forward. And I think many of us saw how incredibly powerful this parliament can be when it does that, and really want to see that continue. The Uluru Statement is based on three things: on voice, on truth and treaty. Three words that can guide our way forward as a nation. And I know there are people who are nervous about that, and nervous in this place, and have made some statements around some of those things. But again, I say, nothing is worth doing if it isn't hard, and if it isn't something that can unify the country in the way that treaty, truth and voice can. A voice to our parliament enshrined in our constitution, truth about our past, without which we can never have reconciliation, and a treaty emerging from the Makarrata Commission, which an Albanese Labor government will establish. As a Shadow Minister, these are not radical propositions, they are a culmination of a century-long journey. I am proud that Labor supports this statement in full, and the government needs to do so as well. The Prime Minister promised a voice to Parliament, and we have yet to see that delivered. This journey started long before Aboriginal people were even counted as citizens, and it's a journey that has endured over long years of hardship and setbacks. They are incredibly patient. They should not have to wait longer. We know what the next step on the journey is because they have told us. We need to listen to our First Nations peoples, we need to listen to the Uluru Statement, and we need to take that next step together. 14 years is a long time to wait. 14 years, hopefully, will not be in vain.
Order. I call the member for Cooper.
Deputy Speaker. I rise as well to address the Chamber to acknowledge the 14th anniversary of the National Apology. I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose land we meet on for every parliamentary sitting and where we are meeting today. I'm proud to acknowledge the traditional owners of my own electorate, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm also incredibly proud to pay homage to William Cooper, the namesake of my electorate. He was a First Nations man born in 1860 who fought for the rights and advancements of Aboriginal people, and the fight continues. The National Apology was a watershed moment in Australian history. It recognised the deep and brutal trauma of those from the stolen generation who'd been taken from their families. As the member for Barton so movingly put it yesterday, put yourself in the shoes of a 3-year-old, wrapped in the love of a large family, to have that love ripped away. It recognised the immense pain, and it met that raw wound with a sincere apology. Our nation failed people. Australia enacted a cruel brutality upon too many of our First Nations people. And finally, our national leader said sorry. I'd like to quote from the speech made 14 years ago by our Prime Minister. He said, "For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry." It was an extremely meaningful moment for so many of us, for so many Australians. The apology tore through an insidious and long-term silence about these acts of horror and violence. The whole nation paused and reflected. We thought of those who hadn't been given a platform to tell their story. We thought of the intergenerational trauma that ripped across families, across communities and cultures. We thought of the loss of language, the loss of culture, the loss of identity and family that people endured and still painfully endure today. And for Australians that do not have First Nations heritage, we confronted the dark side of our nation's history and grappled with the truth that each of us or our families may have contributed to this mistreatment or indeed held silence surrounding these issues. I remember where I was 14 years ago when then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd delivered the apology. I was on the lawns of Parliament with my colleagues, my nursing colleagues, from the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nurses and midwives. I can't tell you what an honour it was to stand there and share that day, that moment, with those wonderful women. And I do remember, not so proudly, that we all turned our backs on the then opposition leader Brendan Nelson, who referred to alcoholism, corruption and abuse. That was offensive. That was wrong. It did not hold the tenor of that auspicious moment. The Prime Minister's speech aimed to move Australia forward. It was a turning point in history. Words are powerful and actions are even more powerful. And that's why Labor is so committed to deliver the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. This commitment is underscored by 3 important words and all the values and empowerment that sit within them: voice, treaty, truth. My electorate of Cooper is home to many First Nations Australians. We have many amazing First Nations organisations that are domiciled in Cooper, and within them there are so many individuals who embody strength, resilience and leadership. There's also anger. Anger at persistent racism, at the gap that still has not been closed, and anger at the many ways that colonialism continues to play out in the lives and experiences of First Nations Australians. Apologies are important. Listening is important. And actions are even more important. But, Deputy Speaker, demanding forgiveness after an apology is unforgivable. An apology must not be given not with an expectation of forgiveness, but with sincere remorse and the promise of addressing the injustice. You don't say sorry because you expect to be forgiven. You say sorry to truly apologise. An apology is not a transaction. You can't set the terms of an apology. It should never demand forgiveness of those who are wronged. I've had many people reach out in the past day furious that one Prime Minister could say something so offensive in the context of another Prime Minister's authentic apology. The PM has a growing, or maybe an even ingrained pattern of telling victims and survivors how they should behave, what they should say, whether or not they should smile, and now when they should forgive. He says that "I forgive you" are the 3 hardest words to say, but I believe the hardest 3 words for those opposite to say are voice, treaty, truth. This is the greatest piece of unfinished business for this Parliament and for Australia. Thank you.
Order. I call the member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. I just want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this Parliament meets, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. As the member for Chifley, I'm proud to represent people who either hail from or live on Darug land, and I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past and present there. And it gives me enormous pride to be able, and it is an enormous honour to represent within the electorate of Chifley, one of the largest urban-based Aboriginal communities in the country. It's something that I wear as a badge of honour, and I take very seriously beyond just making that reference, that we do things to help in every step of the way. The apology means something to a lot of people in our area because they were members of Stolen Generations. And I want to tell you, Deputy Speaker, I've sat with a lump in my throat listening in particular to one story where I had a brother and sister who were taken away from their folks, and they thought for some reason their parents were deficient, and they never got to see their parents. Their parents worked multiple jobs just so that they could earn money to send to those kids that never made it to those kids. And those kids thought that their parents didn't love them. And it was only after they died and these kids, who then grew up to adults, learned the true story and now carry around, like a stone, the guilt that they felt what they did about their parents. So it's pretty tough. And there's no better way to tell a person they mean nothing, and I mean nothing, to put a number on them, to take away their name, to take away who they are, to stop them speaking their language, to stop them celebrating their culture, to disconnect them from the land. And that's what we did. The apology is really important. And as was said a number of times yesterday, it's not about making people feel guilty. It's just asking what we ask people to do every single day: understand what happened to us, just appreciate, walk in our shoes for a bit. And there's an elder in my neck of the woods, Uncle Greg Sims, who always, whenever he does acknowledgement of country, says, before you take your next step, remember the ones who took the steps before you. And I think that is a good thing just for living life, right? So it is important. The apology is important. The apology came about when Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, said it. It was because for years we had another Prime Minister who believed it was just empty symbolism and wouldn't do it. And there was this whole thing about practical reconciliation. But you can do both things. Symbolism matters, because if it doesn't, with the greatest respect, Deputy Speaker, why are you sitting down? Why are you elevated before us? Why do we have flags? Why am I speaking from here? Why don't I sit down and deliver this speech? All these things, verbal and non-verbal and otherwise, mean something. Symbolism is a big deal for us, it's a big deal for others. And so we should do both the symbolism plus the thing of making a difference. Now, the reason I mention this, Deputy Speaker, is because right now in my community, one of the biggest communities, I stress, we have an Aboriginal medical service that's not run by the local Aboriginal community. It's hit the wall, it's into administration.
Order. It being 6:30 p.m, the debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order for the next day's sitting. The member will have leave to continue speaking when the debate is resumed on a future day. I call the clerk.
A government business order of the day, number 2, grievance debate.
The question is that grievances be noted. I call the member for Adelaide.
Deputy Speaker. And Deputy Speaker, the controversy around Novak Djokovic's visa brought to light again a much and greater tragedy, one that unfortunately has not received nearly enough attention. Djokovic was detained in Melbourne's Park Hotel alongside more than 30 refugees and asylum seekers who have been locked in there in some cases for more than a year. Among those men held there are refugees who have been in detention for almost a decade. Deputy Speaker, think about it for a minute. Forced to stay for almost a year locked up. You cannot leave the hotel and you have very little access to fresh air. It sounds like anything but ideal. This is like a permanent state of quarantine and lockdown for these people. And many of us remember how hard that was, those of us that have done some quarantine. Now, for the refugees in detention in Australia, whether in a hotel or any other detention centre, on or offshore, is that they have no end date. There is no end date. For those of us that did lockdown and had to self-isolate, etc., there was an end date. They came looking for safety and found themselves in indefinite detention. We may have stopped the boats and people arriving from offshore to Australia under treacherous conditions, but we cannot forget that there were real people on those boats. This government is only concerned with instilling fear about asylum seekers in the Australian public, and that's what we see time and time again. The Prime Minister even went so far as to deny that the men held at the Melbourne Hotel were genuine refugees. He instead accused them on 2GB radio of simply not wanting to return to their home countries. Well, Deputy Speaker, this was just plain wrong. Reports suggest, in fact, that there are 25 refugees and 7 asylum seekers currently held in the Park Hotel. Now, let's be clear, Deputy Speaker, some form of administrative detention for people without valid visas is common around the world, and no one is advocating for an open slather, but it should be designed to be temporary while a person's application is assessed. Deputy Speaker, evidence from around the world shows that Australia is unique in its policy of indefinite detention. For example, on average, people are detained for 48 days in the US, 24 in Canada, while 90% in UK's immigration system are held for less than 6 months. As of September 2021, Australia's own average is almost 2 years, 689 days. Now, I'm not too sure if that's a record that we can be proud of, Deputy Speaker. Detention was never meant to be indefinite. In fact, indefinite arbitrary detention is a violation of all laws, international human laws, international human rights laws. These people have not conducted themselves or found to be criminals. No court has found them of wrongdoing or harm to someone else. The effects on these men, women and children in indefinite detention can't be ignored. Now, since 2013, more than 3,000 asylum seekers and refugees have been transferred to offshore detention. And the government has done this again without a clear plan, without a clear end date. As a result, some people have found themselves in detention for almost a decade, and where they have suffered abuse, inhumane treatment and medical neglect in many circumstances. In this time, 12 people have died in Australia's offshore detention system, including from murder, medical neglect and suicide, and not to mention the long-term costs to people's mental health. And again, Deputy Speaker, it appears that the government has no plan or solution for these people. Adults should be detained for the shortest time necessary. And as I said earlier, no one is advocating for open slather. There has to be processes and there has to be a system whereby people come to this country, but not detained indefinitely. And children should not be placed in immigration detention at all. We're talking about children. We've all had children, many of us in this room. Think of your children as 5-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 7-year-olds being detained in a detention centre. It is absolutely abhorrent. Deputy Speaker, the annual cost of detaining a single asylum seeker in PNG or Nauru is around $3.4 million. But the cost is just one side of this argument. It's ultimately the human toll that should concern us all. I've called for more humane treatment of refugees for a long time here in Australia. For example, on this side, we supported the use of community detention where appropriate while people are having their applications finalised. And this is both more humane, more cost-effective, and it is something that became very evident to Australians as those that followed the case of Murugapan in Biloela, the Tamil family, and we would have all seen them on the news and on our TVs. The Tamil family, Priya and Nadis, and their Australian-born daughters, Kopika and Thanika, had lived happily in the Queensland town of Biloela for 4 years. They were welcomed in the community wanted them to stay, they were part of the community, they contributed to the town through their work, and they made many, many friends in the community. And this is why there was such an outcry from the people of that town when, after having their application for asylum rejected, they were removed from their home and detained on Christmas Island. And there's been a strong and vocal campaign by the people of Biloela to have the family return to their home. And this campaign and the family's plight touched many around the nation. The family was separated after the youngest daughter was evacuated from Christmas Island to receive urgent medical treatment in Perth. Deputy Speaker, Australians watched in disbelief as the government initially refused to reunite the family. The outcry was so great that Minister Hawke finally granted the family a 3-month bridging visa so they could live in community detention in Perth close to their other daughter. The family has now won a court challenge against the Immigration Minister's decision, effectively barring them from reapplying for bridging visas. Now, all family members, excluding Thanika, have now been granted bridging visas until December 2022. Deputy Speaker, in this family's case, community support is exceptionally strong. for this family to be returned to live in the community they love and the community that has welcomed them so warmly. The Immigration Minister could ensure this happens with a stroke of a pen if he chooses to do so. But what this case illustrates is when Australians are able to see and understand the people behind the headlines, they understand the need for greater compassion, and they understand the need for alternative solutions to indefinite detention. For example, this government should take advantage of other countries' offers to resettle these people. We on this side have long called for the Australian government to accept New Zealand's repeated offers to take some of these refugees, and yet the government continues to refuse. Now, Deputy Speaker, I believe we must work toward ending indefinite detention and finding long-term domestic and regional solutions. The Djokovic case has exposed the treatment of refugees in Australia for the world to see. The attention from national and international media gave these refugees some hope. It's our job now to ensure that they are treated fairly and humanely. Deputy Speaker, it is possible to have strong borders while still actively working towards a more humane long-term regional solution. Australians are a compassionate nation. We've welcomed migrants and refugees throughout the 200 years of white settlement from all over the world. We look at the Chinese students after the Tiananmen Square massacres, and we gave them the ability to be able to, those that were here as students and others that were here, to stay. We've welcomed people from Kosovo, from Bosnia, from all over the world when there's been tragic situations that are taking place. Migration and refugees are part of this country. That's what's made us the wonderful country that we are. And we shouldn't stop and use these people for political footballs, because that's all we're doing. We're using human lives as political footballs to gain political point scoring, and it's wrong. I recall one of the most embarrassing moments I'd ever had in my life talking politics with the Mayor of Athens. I had a meeting with him in 2012, I think it was, and he asked me about the issues and problems that we're having with refugees and boat arrivals. And he asked me this question: how many have arrived by boat non-authorised in your country? And at the time, I think it was around 6,000. And I said to him, approximately 6,000 or 6,500. And he roared with laughter. He said to me, "And you call that a problem, 6,000 in a country of less than 20 million at the time, in a nation, a continent the size of Australia? We have 500 unauthorised people here in Athens alone, and we still haven't made the fuss that you are making over in Australia." And that is proof in the pudding that as a nation that respects human rights, we should adhere to those human rights, and we should be a more humane government and nation in these issues.
Order. The question is that grievances be noted, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Coming to this parliament for me was about two things. It was about service to our community and delivering for our community as well. And I have to say that for most of us, we are not just in here as elected representatives of our communities, but also as people whose homes are in those communities that we seek to serve. And that's why politics has a fundamental attraction to me. And in fact, before I was elected to this place, I had the honour of serving at the local government level, where I was able to serve our community most directly. But I also saw how strong our community in the Lower North Shore was through my involvement in many community organisations, be it Rotary, be my involvement in the Crow's Nest Centre, through local school councils and many other organisations as well. So I'm proud that as someone who has been part of the Lower North Shore community for over 20 years now, that during my 5 or 6 years as a member of this place, we have been able to achieve so much as a federal government to support what I happen, a little bit biased, to think is one of the most incredible parts of Australia, and certainly Sydney. And I wanted to reflect on some of those achievements tonight, because the achievements span the full range of community activities in North Sydney. I wanted to start with some of those essential services which are so important to our community. And I'm proud of the fact that under this coalition government, we have seen an increase in services in areas like health, with, for example, funding for the Royal North Shore Hospital and healthcare on the North Shore at record levels. I'm proud of the fact that we've seen increased funding flowing to aged care. I'm proud of the support that we've been able to provide to our schools, both government and non-government. But I'm also particularly proud in an area of Sydney that is passionate about our local environment of what we've been able to achieve in relation to protecting some of our magnificent harbour foreshores. And for me, one of the projects that I've been most involved with has been the work of the Sydney Harbour Federation Trust at the two sites that lie within my electorate. At the Woolwich Dock, we've seen increased funding to support its ongoing restoration. But more particularly, at Sub-Base Platypus, the old submarine base, we are in the final stages of creating what is such a magnificent community facility. It is not often that you have the opportunity to create around our crowded harbour foreshores new open space, new parks and new community facilities. And that's what this government has been able to achieve. And soon construction will begin with support from this government of what will be the final but probably most significant part of its rehabilitation as a community site. And that will come with the demolition of the old torpedo factory and the creation of even more parkland. The harbour foreshore is a precious part of our local community, both because of its intrinsic environmental values, but because of the opportunity to create more recreational space. And we are a community that is seeing a growing population, but also a change in the population. We are seeing more and more younger families moving to our area, and that has put pressure on many of our existing recreational facilities, and particularly our sporting facilities. So a big focus for my work as the member for North Sydney has been to make sure that, to the extent the federal government can, we are supporting an increase in the capacity of our local sporting facilities. And that's been reflected in some of the projects that I've successfully fought for. I think particularly of the fact that we've been able to, and I saw this just a week or so ago when I visited the Lane Cove Swim Club, to be able to support Lane Cove Council rebuild the outdoor pool at Lane Cove, which was at risk of falling into the pottery green below it and needed to be completely rebuilt. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing at the moment to support North Sydney Council rebuild North Sydney Pool, a pool that has national profile as one of the most beautiful pools in our country. And again, it faced major structural issues with a grandstand that had been there since the Empire Games were held there and actually was the catalyst for its construction, and a pool shell which was cracking and leaking water into Sydney Harbour at an alarming rate. And through the $10 million we're providing, that pool is now being rebuilt in a way that will serve future generations. But they don't stop there. We've seen projects, including in my first term at Gore Hill, to make Gore Hill Oval one of the best AFL facilities in Sydney and recognised as such by the AFL. We've seen major works at Thompson Park to create better amenities for the users of that oval. We've seen funding provided to allow better facilities at Boronia Park in the western end of my electorate. We are seeing projects being developed by councils that will be supported by the federal government to improve facilities at Tunks Park. We've seen work across the electorate and in Lane Cove at Tantallon Oval, such an important facility, a new facility for players and viewers of sporting activities being constructed there as well with federal support. But I'm also proud of the fact that we are providing support for a number of game-changing projects which will improve the amenity of some of our densely populated areas. And I particularly think of the Willoughby City Council's projects in Chatswood to revitalise some of the parts of the Chatswood CBD. And in Spring Place, over $1 million of federal funding will support a major revitalisation there. But I'm also very proud of the support that we've been able to give to community groups, large and small. And at the large end of the spectrum, the Doherty Centre in Chatswood, a major community facility, is going through a major upgrade with around $1 million of federal support allowing that to occur. But what I particularly have welcomed is the fact that we've been able to get federal funding for some of the smaller community organisations. I think, for example, of the Scouts. Many of our local Scout halls have been reinvigorated with the support of federal funding. And I've also seen that work extend to other organisations like some of our local bowling clubs as well. And I'm also proud of the fact that we've been able to provide support to those community organisations as they make sure that they're playing their part in meeting our goal, our national goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And those small grants are making a difference. I've seen projects that have allowed those small organisations to put solar panels on their roofs. I've seen grants that are allowing them to deploy more energy efficient infrastructure. Just recently I was at the wonderful Giant Step School, which supports autistic children, and saw what they're doing there to improve their energy efficiency with some of our grants. And at the other end of the electorate, the wonderful people at the Greenway Public Housing Complex, again funding to allow their major community kitchen to operate more efficiently. These are all tangible ways in which individual community groups are able to contribute to lowering our national emissions. And finally, I wanted to talk about an area that is particularly close to my heart, and that is the arts. And we have a wonderful arts community in North Sydney, a very vibrant one, theatres, music groups, and so on, art galleries. And I am very proud of the fact that we've been able to provide funding to some of those organisations. I think, for example, of the magnificent Ensemble Theatre. In fact, the grant that I helped secure to get solar panels on their roofs, I think was the very first government grant, state or federal, that the Ensemble Theatre had ever received. And I think also of some of the grants that we've been able to get for organisations like the Lane Cove Youth Orchestra, such a magnificent orchestra, extending the reach of music into the hearts and minds of young people in our district. And finally, through many of our programs, we've been able to directly support those providing volunteer services to community groups. They can be the small grants that go to organisations like Rotary, Scouts and others, but they can also be the bigger grants that come through the Stronger Communities program, which is making a meaningful difference for many of those volunteer-based organisations. Of course, our region has many other problems, and transport is the most obvious of one of those. I wanted to conclude by talking about, as someone who is passionate about the role of public transport in our cities, the fact that our government has been able to provide, I think, $1.7 billion towards the Metro project, which is going to so dramatically increase the opportunities for residents to use our rail network through the new Metro system. Now, of course, that $1.7 billion goes to a project that extends from Bankstown to Chatswood. But for our area, it's meaning new stations at places like Crow's Nest and North Sydney, increasing access, a couple of minutes to Barangaroo, a couple more to Martin Place or other parts of the city. And that of itself is not only going to provide easier access for residents, but is also going to help revitalise and maintain the role of centres like North Sydney and Chatswood and Crow's Nest as well in a very positive way. These are all important contributions that this government and that I have been able to make to support our local community. I'm very proud of those achievements, and if I have the great honour of being re-elected, they will continue to be my focus.
The question is that grievance has been noted, and I call the member for Oxley.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm proud to represent an electorate that is amongst the most multicultural in this country. 60,000 people who live in the Oxley electorate were born overseas, and we have the highest number of people with Vietnamese heritage anywhere in Queensland. The very best of cultures from every corner of the globe come together to make our community great. And later this month, we will mark International Mother Language Day, a day to highlight the importance of cultural and linguistic diversity and remember the role they play in building sustainable societies. Across my electorate, we celebrate many languages: Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Tongan, Hindi, Bengali, Tamil, Greek and Italian, just to name a few. By preserving their mother languages, the people in my community are fostering peace and respect and passing down their proud and rich family histories to their children. We are creating a society where differences in culture and languages are celebrated as important and irreplaceable parts of the fabric of Australian life. I want to thank members of the community who are doing important work to keep diversity alive, including my friend Dr. Jishu Gupta from the local Bangladeshi community, who works year after year to raise awareness about the loss of mother languages. I'm proud that in my electorate, members of the community tell the Australian story in diverse languages, celebrating where they've come from to become part of this country's bright future. While there is much to celebrate in the electorate of Oxley, I must also use this opportunity in the parliament to express my increasing concern for the aged care residents that I represent. This government's persistent incompetence means that the same mistakes are being repeated again and again. From initial botched vaccination rollout to the botched booster rollout, we are stuck in a cycle of acting far too late. Thousands of booster clinics were rolled out in aged care homes across the country, but they didn't vaccinate staff at the same time as residents. This is a shocking missed opportunity, indicative of this government's entire response to this pandemic. Let's not forget the issues that plagued the initial rollout of vaccines in aged care. The deadline to fully vaccinate all residents and staff by Easter 2021 was missed by 6 months. Vaccine clinics routinely missed residents and did not vaccinate staff. Vaccine clinics were routinely cancelled and delayed. There was no plan by the government to assist workers to get vaccinated outside of work. And now, with boosters, we've seen similar chaos. The deadline to booster residents by 31st of January 2022 was missed and still hasn't been achieved, with up to 60,000 residents still unprotected. Vaccine clinics have been missing residents and not vaccinating staff. There's been no plan to get the boosters into people's arms. The booster mandate for work has been announced months too late, despite being recognised as inevitable by providers. Mr Deputy Speaker, these are mistakes that our aged care residents simply cannot afford. Frail, older Australians have paid an extreme price for the government's incompetence, with prolonged lockdowns, isolation from loved ones and, tragically, over 681 deaths in 2022 alone. That's 681 deaths this year, and we're in the second week of February. Older Australians built this country. They and their families deserve so much better than this. They deserve better than a government whose arrogance prevents them from learning from their own mistakes. Mr Deputy Speaker, we know that mistakes are part of life. Everyone makes them, but we must learn from them. We're now entering our third year of a pandemic, and the Prime Minister still stubbornly refuses to learn the errors of his mistakes. He never takes responsibilities. The Black Summer bushfires, the vaccine rollout, the booster rollout, rapid antigen tests, all opportunities for the Prime Minister to step up and show leadership, to take responsibility. And yet tonight, of all nights, when we should be debating aged care, should be debating RATs, should be debating what we can do to help Australia, what is this government focused on? What is this Prime Minister focused on? Sacking yet another minister in the government, but not telling the minister he's going to be sacked. Yet how do we know about this, Mr Deputy Speaker? A leak from the government. The third serious leak. We saw criminal leaks from the government last week. This is not from the Labor Party. This is not from the opposition. This is from the government's own side. People sitting around the inner sanctum of the Prime Minister, sitting around the Cabinet, not worried about how we can deliver rapid antigen tests to Australians in need, not worried about people in aged care residential facilities, not worrying about securing work, not worrying about being able to see a GP, completely and utterly focused on themselves, completely and utterly worried about their own jobs, not worried about the rest of Australian jobs. Well, it is enough. Enough is enough from this government. Stop focusing on yourselves. Stop talking about yourselves and start working for the Australian community. We know that this government's only interested in a couple of things in the dying days of this term of Parliament. Trying to wedge the opposition, trying to run scare campaigns. There's no legislation on the agenda this week. And now tonight we're seeing leaked from the government a hit on another minister. The Education Minister, who's been off leave for 3 months, who was a pretty ordinary minister to start with. This is the same minister that delivered car park rorts, then turned into the Education Minister, and now is being rolled out of the Cabinet again. On it goes and on it goes. It is simply unacceptable. My community have had a gutful of this government completely and utterly focused on themselves. So Australians are paying the price for this incompetence. I mean, we're seeing RAT tests unavailable to people who need it. The Prime Minister used one of his favourite excuses and said it's up to the states to source rats. This is ridiculous. It's absolutely Scott Morrison's, the Prime Minister's responsibility. Labor believes that rats should be free and accessible for all Australians. PCR tests are free for everyone through Medicare. So why aren't rats? Nobody should be denied a test because they can't afford one. This is the right approach from a health and economic perspective. The economy doesn't work if people can't go to work. And in the midst of a pandemic, many people simply can't go to work if they can't get a test. Now, the government and the Prime Minister was warned about this. They were told that this was going to happen. But the arrogance is astounding by this Prime Minister. He never listens, never owns up to his mistakes. We know he doesn't hold a hose unless he's shampooing someone's hair. We know that time and time again that he's ducking for cover all the time. Now he's ducking for cover because his own cabinet ministers, the people who know him best, I won't even get started, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the text messages. We know what the current Deputy Prime Minister said when he was not the Deputy Prime Minister, when he said that the Prime Minister couldn't be trusted. In fact, he said he could never trust him. But then we know that the current Deputy Prime Minister, when he came back after knifing the former Deputy Prime Minister, said, well, I didn't really know him that well. That's why I sent that text. Didn't deny the text. Said, well, that's why I didn't know him. But despite the fact, when he was the former Deputy Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister was the Treasurer. I mean, does anyone on the other side of the chamber think how ridiculous this all sounds? Just how stupid the government looks. It is so embarrassing to be a Member of Parliament when we're seeing members of Parliament on the other side, the so-called government, when they're not protesting outside the front of this building with the whack jobs from the anti-vaxxers lining up to encourage them, protesting outside vaccination clinics, and of course no one pulls them into line. Freedom of speech. We can't have any of that. This goes to what is wrong with this government. They are completely and utterly focused on themselves, all worried about their own jobs, not worried about the jobs of Australians. So Prime Minister Scott Morrison is a Prime Minister who does too little, too late. This is not about 2020 hindsight. Throughout this pandemic, Labor has been time and time again urging the Prime Minister to listen to expert advice. But time and time again, our calls have fallen on deaf ears. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will not stop trying. We won't stop calling this government out to do more to protect aged care residents. We won't stop calling out this government to do more to deliver rapid antigen tests to those who need it. But more importantly, we want a government that will lead, not focus on themselves.
The question is that grievance has been noted, and I call the member for Bennelong.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In July, Japanese Ambassador Yamagami Shingo spoke at the National Press Club. Mr Yamagami is the most senior diplomat to hold the post of ambassador to Australia. His seniority reflects the importance of our relationship at a time of critical issues in the region, the same as those which have resulted in the formation of Quad 4 with India, Japan, the US and Australia. There is a clear need in all these countries to form even stronger bonds with our allies and trading partners. His speech was timed to coincide with the opening of the Olympic Games, but just as the Olympics are as much about opportunities as sport, Mr Yamagami took the opportunity to spruik the great potential that could be unlocked if our countries worked closer together. Mr Yamagami said his dream was to partner with Australia to roll out Shinkansen network in Australia. It will surprise no one who has listened to me before that I found this a very exciting idea. I've met with the Ambassador on a number of occasions since his speech, and he remains passionate about the possibilities. His passion comes from his experience living outside of the chaos and hubbub of central Tokyo, but still being able to commute there every day. Since committing to high-speed rail back in the 70s, Japan has seen its cities completely changed as overcrowding and extreme growth pressures have been averted by allowing people from further out to commute. These regional hubs have in turn seen huge levels of development and growth, so they are now cities and destinations in their own right. This is the purpose of high-speed rail, not simply the provision of transport between two destinations. Rather, it is the catalyst for a whole-scale reimagining of settlement, easing congestion, housing costs and growth pressures in our major cities while spreading prosperity to our regions. It should be clear that this is the solution to the problems that we face here in Australia today. With no plan of settlement, we have a random imbalance focused on Melbourne and Sydney, overwhelming their infrastructure capacity and strangling potential growth. Our two major cities take some 85% of immigrants and suffer some of the highest house prices on the planet. Our major cities are coal-guzzling, high-emitting old cities with no effective plan of decentralisation put in place. This problem will only worsen. These are the same problems that Japan faced. Like them, we could use the solution to these problems as a way of jump-starting our economy in these uncertain times and assist in our recovery. The creation of new, smart, zero-emission cities, commutable times from our major CBDs, will create mega-regions that will compete on the world stage as a launchpad and destinations of significance. We can create affordable housing and stimulate faltering regions. We will be able to incentivise hubs of health or manufacturing as we redesign our new cities of the future. All this, and while doing more for the environment than any other plan put forward so far. Recent years has seen the engine of economic growth moving out of cities and into mega regions, like the northeast of the United States and the Rhine corridor, high-speed rail between Newcastle to Melbourne, and eventually up to the Sunshine Coast will create a mega region that can compete globally against these other centres. While the academic and community will is there, getting political momentum is proving harder. And it is clear that over the last few decades, nothing at all has been done. In the last 40 years, the government has spent over $135 million on inquiries into high-speed rail, and yet not one track has been laid. The first problem is cost, but this isn't such a problem. Building this infrastructure will be expensive, that's undeniable. But when you compare the low cost of regional land currently with the cost of land in Sydney and Melbourne, or the cost of land in comparable mega regions, it is clear that so great an uplift can fund the cost of the infrastructure many times over. We just have to find a way to capture this uplift and hypothecate it towards the cost of the infrastructure. The last two inquiries into high-speed rail that I have chaired found that high-speed rail has never been funded by the ticket price alone, but it is paid for by gaining a share of the uplift in properties impacted by this transformational infrastructure. At this time, the Victorian Government has announced a rezoning impost of 50%, and New South Wales a similar proposed impost on uplifting resulting from rezoning or from infrastructure investment. This is the start of the funding, but when aligned across borders and matched with federal commitments to commit capital gains tax revenues into the equation, it becomes even more profitable. Further levies on hyper profits, like those seen at Badgerys Creek, should also be captured. This should not be seen as the introduction of a tax. This is a clear justification of retrieving some of the gains that have only been created by investment of taxpayers' money, that the taxpayer should recoup some of their investment back from the multi-millionaire landowners is only fair and should be electorally popular. The other main reason it doesn't quite get up is the electoral cycle. 3-year terms incentivise small-scale projects that can be announced one election and delivered by the next. Media bites can accompany each small stage, and the prevailing belief is that these give huge benefit to the electoral prospects of members. Pork barrelling is par for the course in Australia and is clearly done openly by both sides of politics. But just because everybody does it doesn't mean it's right. I've stood next to enough pedestrian crossings and roundabouts to know that they don't bring much support, and almost never fix the root cause of the problems that are generally caused by much larger structural issues and lack of planning. So the bread and butter of the political game is not what will make Australia great and not allow us to fulfil our potential. National infrastructure on this scale is clearly well outside the interests of this small-scale electoral cycle. Planning settlement and building huge pieces of infrastructure are the work of decades, not 3 years, and long-term plans that remain constant are less attractive in a political climate that prioritises new announcements over large deliveries. This is probably why we haven't seen a new interstate passenger train line built for the best part of a century. To break this cycle, we need to have a policy that will withstand the changes of a fluid electoral system. We need a plan that is supported across the parliamentary aisle. So therefore, I ask the question, when will this place put important issues above politics and cooperate with each other and agree long-term master planning of settlement? When will we agree on the essential infrastructure and a sustainable funding system that demands those lucky landowners who profit so extraordinarily through the investment of taxpayers and favourable rezoning? We must have a master planning of settlement, master planning of infrastructure and master planning of funding to master our future. So please, let's stop butting heads and get those heads together to serve us better. Bipartisanship is not the end of this combative parliament. There will still be differences on how and when we roll out the plans and tweaks along the way, but we must let those issues be the things we debate, not whether or not we take up these great challenges that will make such a difference to us now and in the future. This is too important to ignore.
I thank the member for Bennelong. The question is the grievance has been noted, and I give the call to the honourable member for Richmond.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise tonight to highlight our community fight to save Coogin state significant farmland. Now, last week it was revealed that a private consortium will seek New South Wales Government approval to advance a mega development on 5.7 hectares of state significant farmland next to the new Tweed Valley Hospital at Coogin. Now, for this massive development to go ahead, developers will need to be working very closely with the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals to change the zoning of the state significant farmland adjacent to the new hospital site. Now, in response to this extraordinary news, myself, Walt Seckle, the New South Wales Shadow Minister for Police and the North Coast, and Rhys Burns, the Tweed Shire Deputy Mayor, have together called upon the Tweed Nationals MP Jeff Provis to take responsibility and called on him to resign from State Parliament if his government moves to rezone state significant farmland at Coogin for developers. Now, when the new Tweed Valley Hospital was approved on state significant farmland, locals were repeatedly promised by Tweed Nationals MP Jeff Provis that there will be no further development on the adjoining state significant farmland. And make no mistake about it, Jeff Provis must keep his election promise and ensure that his government does not rezone any part of that remaining state significant farmland at Coogin. In fact, on Prime 7 North Coast News on the 3rd of March 2020, when questioned about rezoning the land, Mr Provis stated it was his election commitment to keep that land zoned as state significant and they, the government, would follow through with that. Well, this issue has now become an escalating integrity crisis for Jeff Provis. And if this land is rezoned, then he needs to take responsibility and resign from State Parliament, because his election in 2019 would then have been based on a lie. Now, Deputy Speaker, everyone wants a new Tweed hospital, But we don't want this to open the door for massive overdevelopment on Coogin farmlands. I'd like now to actually turn to the developer of this new project. Now, the private consortium behind the proposed $250 million project are joint partners, Centuria Capital Group and Digital Infratech. The director of Digital Infratech is Alan Larkin. Now, the proposed site for the project was purchased in February 2019 by IRBS1 Proprietary Limited, which formerly traded as Aspect Property Group. The owner of Aspect is Alan Larkin, the director of Digital Infratech. And at the time of the land purchase, it was widely publicly reported that Aspect had donated numerous times to the Liberal National Party in Queensland. And searches revealed that Aspect had donated more than $28,000 to the LNP in Queensland, including the infamous LNP Forward Brisbane Leadership Fund. So, Deputy Speaker, we are now calling on Jeff Probus to publicly release all correspondence he has been engaged in about this specific parcel of land or the proposed development, including emails, texts, or letters from these developers, any lobbyists, colourful National Party identities, or from within his own government or departments. We want to see all of that correspondence. Now, Labor's always been committed to protecting the Coogin farmland from development, and that has not changed. And while we don't know the full details of this $250 million project, and it may have some merits, it should not be built on state-significant farmland. Now, for the record, Labor's always supported the building of a new hospital for the Tweed. Our concern was that the location of the new hospital on state-significant farmland would open Kingscliff to overdevelopment. And with the re-election of the state Liberal National Government in 2019, the matter of the hospital location was settled. But this new proposed development validates all the concerns that Labor and the community had at the time about overdevelopment in the area. Now, straight after the 2019 state election, we made it very clear that we would hold the New South Wales Liberal National Government to account for delivering the new hospital on time, keeping their election promise for free parking at the new hospital, which to date they have failed to guarantee. We also said we'd be holding them to account to ensure the current Tweed Hospital stays in public hands and to stop the New South Wales Government from selling off the current hospital site to developers. And we made that strong commitment to hold the government to account to not allow any more development on state-significant farmland at Coogin. Now, we've consistently raised these issues and we will continue to do so. So ultimately, if Tweed Nationals MP Jeff Probus and his government rezones Coogin state-significant farmland for developers, Jeff Probus must take responsibility and resign from the New South Wales State Parliament. Now, Deputy Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to our frontline healthcare workers. They have been outstanding throughout the pandemic, and they've just done this without the support and resources from the Morrison government or the New South Wales government. And today I stand with our nurses in New South Wales and support them, who are striking for the first time in a decade. And they're doing that because they're just fed up. They can't take it anymore. They don't have enough staff, they don't have enough resources, and therefore they can't provide that adequate care to their patients. And I especially acknowledge the incredible nurses on the New South Wales North Coast, the heroes of the pandemic. Our healthcare workers have been on the front line throughout the pandemic, going above and beyond day in, day out, sometimes putting themselves at risk. They have worked so incredibly hard for our community. The fact is they're overworked and exhausted. Of course, this issue existed long before COVID, and the pandemic's just increased the problem. And what they desperately need is support from the government. Our community values our nurses, and it's time for the New South Wales government to listen to them when they're crying out for more support. Now, New South Wales Premier and his government have shown no respect to health workers, refusing to listen to their concerns about safely staffing our hospitals. They need to listen. Instead, what have they done? They've frozen their pay. They refuse to look at nurse-to-patient ratios. The government needs to listen and act. Our nurses are at breaking point, and our local hospitals are at breaking point. Now, Deputy Speaker, the Guardian reported earlier this year that Tweed Heads Hospital had 18 staff resign due to burnout. And that article from the 5th of January reported many nurses were doing double shifts every day, warning they're going to fall over in a screaming heap. And the reports the hospital had to source its own triage tent and that staff have been forced to drive COVID patients around their own cars. It's just appalling. And again, this government, the Morrison government and New South Wales government, knew a surge in cases was coming. They knew, and they were still woefully unprepared. Now, that article I referred to also mentioned the hospital was struggling to source adequate PPE, which is just remarkable. And also, Deputy Speaker, Byron Bay Hospital in my electorate is similarly under the same sort of pressure with staff shortages, PPE shortages and a lack of transport options for COVID-positive patients. And The Guardian reported on the 8th of January that COVID-positive patients are being left in bays behind curtains, and one patient waited 45 hours to be transported to the region's designated COVID hospital. Now, Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government and the New South Wales government's rolling incompetence and mismanagement has caused this dire situation. First, we had the Prime Minister failing to actually order enough vaccines for the nation. And then we had their bungled rollout, never seemed to end, and those of us in the regions were desperate to have it. Then when we finally did have some Pfizer, the New South Wales government stole it from our region and took it back to Sydney. And then, of course, we had the New South Wales government's incompetence in failing to lock down Sydney fast enough, which resulted in the massive spread of Delta right throughout New South Wales. And then, of course, we had limited access to PCR tests, closed over most Christmas times, and locals unable to source rapid tests. They should be free and easily accessible. We have just seen time and time again the incompetence of both the Morrison government and the New South Wales government has led to this dire situation, putting a huge pressure on all of our frontline healthcare workers. And I stand with those nurses today. Thousands of them we saw around the state stand up and say, this is not good enough. They have been working so hard. They have been absolute heroes, and I want to pay tribute to them for working so incredibly hard for our community in these amazingly difficult times. Thank you for your great work, and I call upon the Morrison government and the New South Wales government to start listening to these people who are at the front line doing those hard yards to serve our community throughout this pandemic. And the New South Wales government in particular needs to listen to the concerns of our nurses and what they're looking for. We need to have these services provided so they can care for patients more. This is an urgent crisis, and I call upon both the federal and the state governments to listen to our healthcare workers.
The question is that the grievance has been noted, and I give the call to the member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak about an issue that's very important to the people of Higgins, and that is our recognition of our Indigenous Australians and the wonderful culture that has stretched back more than 60,000 years, the longest living culture on this planet. Mr Deputy Speaker, as Australians, we know that Indigenous Australians have, unfortunately, poorer outcomes than we would hope for, and that is across a whole range of different areas. This includes poor outcomes for health, in education, in housing, in jobs, youths in detention. The list goes on. And Mr Deputy Speaker, it's not easy to tackle these problems. But the Morrison government is doing this by allowing Indigenous voices to work with government. It's an essential part of the way the government has decided to work in a co-design process. Too long, Mr Deputy Speaker, governments have done things to Indigenous Australians, not with Indigenous Australians. This government has taken an approach where we have worked with numerous practical changes by collaborating with Indigenous leaders and having a grassroots approach, so that meaningful changes can be made that symbolise our fundamental importance of Indigenous culture to Australia and its history, but more importantly, practical changes that help close the gap on the inequities that Indigenous Australians have faced for decades. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Morrison government last year released the first Closing the Gap implementation plan, along with $1 billion in new measures to help achieve the outcomes. This includes $378 million for a new redress scheme for stolen generation survivors from the Northern Territory, the Australian Capital Territory and Jervis Bay Territory. And I'm proud to be a member of the National Redress Committee,
that helps oversees this redress scheme, as I note that Mr Deputy Speaker himself is also a member. These factors, these schemes are so important to the long and ongoing healing process. We have to recognise the injustices of the past. We have to deal with the ongoing injustices. This is no small step forward, but it is an important step. An additional $254 million towards infrastructure to better support Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations, affectionately known as ACCHOs. This government is also investing $160 million in new funding to ensure the best start in life for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children through initiatives such as the Healthy Mums and Healthy Bubs program, the Community Childcare Fund and the Connect Beginnings program and Early Years Education program. Mr Deputy Speaker, many years ago, many decades ago now, when I was a medical student, I spent time in the Northern Territory in Arnhem Land. And it's so great to hear that the early pilot programs that were started in those days are now properly and formally federally funded to make sure that the best services can be provided to our newest and youngest Indigenous Australians. This government is also providing increased investment in the Commonwealth's existing Indigenous Languages and Arts program and funding for additional language centres to protect the most at-risk Indigenous languages. Mr Deputy Speaker, anybody who's been to rural and remote parts of Australia understands that these languages are at risk of being lost. There are many hundreds of languages in the Indigenous languages, and to maintain and support them is incredibly important to upholding the richness and diversity of Indigenous Australian culture. So supporting the establishment of a joined-up policy partnership on justice to agree on focus areas for action to derive outcomes on reducing Indigenous incarceration is also another important area that I know in particular the Attorney-General, the Honourable Michaelia Cash, has at the heart of some of the things that she is doing. We will continue to work to close the gap, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I know that this is a bipartisan wish of this parliament. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, in my first speech, I said a strong country is one that is at peace with its past. Non-Indigenous Australians do care deeply about how we show respect to our Indigenous Australians. And this is why the Morrison government has enacted a number of different changes in the last few years, which are symbolic and partner with the practical aspect of the closing the gap investments that have been made. And one of those is the recent change a year ago now to our national anthem from Young and Free, which doesn't reflect the multicultural and Indigenous Australian cultural aspects of our country, but from Young and Free to One and Free, which is much more inclusive of the fact that we are part of, we can partner with a long Indigenous culture that goes back so many thousands, tens of thousands of years. Like the Prime Minister has said, it takes nothing away, but it adds so much. It recognises the distance that we have travelled as a nation and that we still have a place to go. It recognises that our national story is drawn from more than 300 national ancestries and language groups, and we are the most successful multicultural nation on earth, and we must continue to strive to do better to ensure that we are all inclusive of our diverse multicultural heritage. It reaffirms our resolve as one of the world's oldest democracies while honouring the foundations upon which our nation has been built and the aspirations we share for the future. Mr Deputy Speaker, for the last 25 years, the Australian Aboriginal flag has been troubled by copyright claims, effectively rendering the flag private property. As such, the flag could not be used without permission granted and royalties paid, of course not in the least fostering the sense of pride and love that is required for us to embrace the Indigenous flag for all Australians. And in light of this, the Australian government has moved to set the Aboriginal flag free. And the Commonwealth now holds a copyright, and the flag now belongs to everyone, and no one can take that away. The Aboriginal flag will now be managed in a similar manner to the Australian national flag, where its use is free, but it must be presented in a respectful and dignified way. This means all Australians can now put the Aboriginal flag on apparel such as sports jerseys and shirts without having to ask for permission or pay a fee. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the third aspect I'd like to talk about is Nguru, which is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural precinct which has just been funded by the federal government, which is to be built in the Parliamentary Triangle. and this will be an important, meaningful place where learning and knowledge can centre around a national resting place to care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait ancestral remains, and a new home for the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I was honoured to have the Minister for Indigenous Australians, in fact the first Indigenous Australian who is Minister for Indigenous Australians, the Honourable Ken Wyatt, visit Higgins just last week. His approach to his portfolio, which is gentle and reflectful and respectful, brought with us this understanding that all Australians are on the journey of healing and peace with regards to Indigenous Australians, and the concept of yarning, which is walking together and talking together. And we had many visits. One was to the King David School, where we viewed the federally funded Indigenous mural painted by senior school students and First Nations artists together. And we discussed their school's reconciliation action plan and the importance of closing the gap with their very impressive community school leaders, Alex Cohen, the granddaughter of the great Australian Sir Zerlin Cohen, and Ari Epstein, along with Principal Mark Light. The King David has developed a vision statement in conjunction with parents and students, and they are to be congratulated on the work they are doing in Indigenous recognition. Ken Wyatt also came to visit, or the Minister also came to visit Herring Island, where we received an impromptu and knowledgeable guided tour from Rodolfo from Parks Victoria, and shared his in-depth knowledge about the Indigenous sculptures across the island. And lastly, we visited Armour House, where we finished the tour, and we were greatly warmed by the welcoming ceremony from Uncle Steve. We shared a coffee while hearing stories and spoke in a yarning circle with CEO Marg about initiatives of change and their commitment to teaching about our long and rich Indigenous history and culture. At every visit, Mr Deputy Speaker, Minister Wyatt listened and shared insightful learnings of his time as Minister for Indigenous Australians. We're very fortunate to have such a rockstar minister who's working in a very important portfolio. Lastly, I'd like to mention, Mr Deputy Speaker, about the federal government delivering on its commitment to co-design an Indigenous voice that would provide a way for Indigenous Australians to provide advice and input on matters that are important to improve their lives. The government has allocated funding to the co-design process, and following extensive co-design led by 52 members involving more than 9,400 people and organisations, the Indigenous Voice co-design final report was delivered just in December 2021. These are very important initiatives, and I welcome the changes that have been made, the recognition of the importance of Indigenous Australians to all of Australia. There's so much more that we have to do, but Australians have a strong sense of pride in our country, and this needs to include embracing, understanding and caring about our Indigenous Australians. We will work every day to make our country more united and more inclusive. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Higgins. The time for grievance debate has expired. The debate is interrupted in accordance with Standing Order 192B. The debate is adjourned, and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. And I give the call to the member for Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
I call the member for Eden Monero.
I second the motion.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. All those of the opinion say aye. Against? I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.